My next task is to introduce somebody who you may not know, and if you don't know her, you're in for a treat. It's Joni Eareckson Tada. She has been a quadriplegic since she was a teenager, and she's a leading advocate for people with disabilities. She's founder and chief executive officer of Joni and Friends International Disability Center, the author of 50 books, and the host of a radio and television program, Joni and Friends, which reaches a weekly audience of over 1 million listeners. She couldn't be with us today. She lives in California, but she has a video message which we will now show.
Hi friends, I'm Joni Eareckson Tada of the Joni and Friends International Disability Center here in Southern California. And I am so grateful for this chance to share a few words with you at this special conference marking the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, a decision which initially many Americans thought only involved a woman's right to choose. But when the Supreme Court ruled that a woman has the right to end the life of that child that's inside of her, the implications went far beyond her womb. Because once the court dismantled safeguards around the life of the weakest and most vulnerable among us, an unborn child, then the rights of all of us become exposed, especially others who are weak and vulnerable, quadriplegics like me, or the elderly, the mentally ill, people in comas, those with intellectual impairments, and newborns with significant disabilities. The so-called right to privacy, the basis for Roe versus Wade, made the exercise of rights in our country a national competition to see who is more victimized than whose competing claims are the strongest. And when the rights are no longer moral claims, but people's willful determinations dressed up in politically correct language, no one is more exposed than those who are too weak, too small, too old, too uninsured, or too disabled to speak for themselves. Those of us who are disability advocates are watching very closely those states that have physician-assisted suicide laws. Yes, today, states extend aid in dying to those in the last stages of terminal illnesses, but even now, people are challenging what that word, quote, terminal really means, and what the word, quote, illness means. So why not extend physician-assisted suicide to a person severely disabled with multiple sclerosis? At least that's the thinking of many right-to-die advocates. To them, it is a matter of one's privacy rights. Look, I have been in this wheelchair for 45 years. When I was a teenager, I broke my neck in a diving accident, which left me a quadriplegic. Oh, what a fateful dive that was. And my goodness, was I depressed. And I often wonder, looking back, I wonder what loopholes, what caveats that I might have found in those early years of my deep depression had there been death with dignity laws on the books. But my problem back then was not my quadriplegia, it was my depression, and that was successfully treated. The Roe versus Wade decision also began the slow erosion of the public consensus, which up until that time agreed that life is indeed sacred, that it's worth protecting, worth defending. After all, if one's conscience becomes inured or calloused toward an unborn child, then it's easier to diminish the life value of, let's say, someone who is brain injured and in a coma. I've seen it happen. And so now, 40 years later, no longer does the public consensus unite around the moral premise that all life is precious. Instead, The public sympathizes with the depressed quadriplegic who wants to end his life. Why not remove the life supports from a person in a coma? Why not euthanize the newborn with multiple disabilities? Why not refuse treatment for an elderly person, especially in this day when healthcare dollars are so scarce? From physician-assisted suicide to embryonic stem cell research to infanticide and so much more, the disregard for the sacredness of life, it can all be traced back to Roe versus Wade. It's all about treating people as, well, people. People who have inherent worth and dignity, whether they are quadriplegics like me, or the elderly, the unborn, or the newborn with multiple disabilities. Psalm 82 says, quote, "Defend the cause of the weak, maintain the rights of the poor and oppressed, rescue the weak and needy." That is some command. And people with disabilities need advocates like you who will courageously champion the vulnerable, the elderly, those with handicapping conditions, and the medically fragile. People like you who will redefine rights as moral claims based on absolute values. People who will recognize that we are image bearers of a creator God and therefore have intrinsic worth. So, on behalf of the many Americans with disabilities like me, thank you for explaining to your friends and colleagues just how damaging, just how dangerous Roe versus Wade is. Yes, of course, to the unborn child, but also to others at risk. Just because they're too weak or too old or too disabled, just because they lack a strong voice, be their voice. Thank you for your support for life, because all life is worth living. And I say that as a quadriplegic who deals daily with chronic pain and recently battled stage 3 breast cancer. Life is worth the battle. And that's why your participation in this conference matters. So on behalf of the people God was thinking of in Psalm 82, bless you and thank you for listening.
I thought you would find that inspiring. A great woman and a great spokesperson for the inherent dignity of every human life. Our next, well, actually, before I introduce our next speaker, I did want to recognize that we have been joined by another board member, Ed Grant. And now, our next speaker is actually Jerry Bradley, who is a member of our advisory board, so double treat for us, and his wife Pam is here with him, so welcome, Pam. Jerry Bradley is professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches legal ethics and constitutional law, and along with John Finnis, directs the Natural Law Institute and co-edits the American Journal of Jurisprudence, which is an international forum for legal philosophy. He received his BA and JD from Cornell, summa cum laude from the law school. He practiced as a prosecutor in Manhattan, and if you know him, you know that was a good personality fit. And he taught law at the University of Illinois for many years before joining Notre Dame. He's published over 100 scholarly articles and reviews in several books. I've said this in front of his students, so I can say in front of you, I think he's perhaps the best constitutional law scholar in the country. So, Jerry.
Well, thanks very much, Bill, for the introduction. I'm not sure what to make of the comment about being well-suited to being a prosecutor in Manhattan, especially since there's a fact that Bill didn't share with you, which may be relevant to his comment, and it's that I specialized in pimp prosecution. But I want to say nonetheless that it's a special treat for me to be introduced by my friend Bill Saunders, who, given his work over decades now in freedom of religion, pro-life work, pro-family work, has really become a model to so many of us, including myself. I should say that perhaps I first began to work very closely with Bill, well, probably in the late 1990s, when he was doing something entirely unrelated to those particular causes. He was organizing people in America to help our suffering and persecuted brethren in Sudan. And for many years, Bill, he founded and ran for many years the Bishop Gassi Sudan Relief Fund, which was at the time desperately needed, since few, if any, other organizations were taking the risk and traveling to southern Sudan, which was then a war zone. And I know that at one time, Bill was on a trip there on behalf of our group. I believe it was Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and Bill was bombed along with the rest of the people who were attending Mass with him in an African village. But one word about AUL before I get to my talk today, which is about persons and the law and abortion. Just last weekend, Pam and I went to Chicago for an evening play and decided to stay overnight, so we stayed at the Palmer House, Hilton Hotel now. And it reminded us of what I think is our only other stay at the Palmer House in Chicago, which was in the spring of 1984, and the occasion was an AUL conference. And we attended the conference. And I remember, by the way, that the keynote speaker that day was an Oxford Don, a legal philosopher named John Finnis, who has since, over the last 15 or so years, become, as Bill mentioned, my own collaborator at Notre Dame. But it makes me realize that under the leadership of Clark Forsyth at Grant, way back Vic Rosenblum, AUL has been in the forefront at the head table of the pro-life fight, and it's stayed the course. God willing, it won't have to stay the course another 40 years, but that's really the most or highest compliment I can think to an organization in this cause, is just staying at one's post. And Charmaine has taken the organization to even greater heights or more prominence, and I'm just very pleased to be asked to be part of this group. Now, abortion is, I submit, the greatest civil rights issue of our time because it raises uniquely and compellingly the foundational question about law and justice which every society faces. It is the question, who is the law for? For whose benefit do we plan and build and apply this vast apparatus we call the rule of law? Now, this question is foundational because it is prior in status and importance to the question, what shall the law be? It is foundational because answering it right is essential to justice. Anyone can see that even the most refined arrangement of legal rights and duties counts for naught if the strong can, with impunity, manipulate the foundational question and deny the benefits of law to those they wish to exploit. Now, legal thinkers as far back as the 6th century, and I'm thinking of Justinian, saw correctly that law is for persons, not the other way around. Persons are the point of law. Law is their servant. Persons are not for the state, for the fatherland, or for the glory of the common law. These beneficiaries, these persons, are not entities identified through policy analysis. They're not the sums of interests balanced, the deliverables of a vast progressive agenda. These older jurists saw, too, that the question of personhood could not be and was not an intra-systemic riddle solved by a feat of technical legal reasoning and answered with a legal fiction or a term of art, as if the law could be as impervious to the reality of persons as Chancery was to the reality of justice in the case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. Being prior to law and indispensable to justice, the foundational question must be answered according to the truth of the matter. Everyone who really is a person has to count in law as one. Now, clear-headed thinkers through the centuries would have gasped, therefore, at the legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin's view that the question, who counts as a person, is like a membership application to the Rotary Club. Dworkin said, do those who already count want to open up the membership rolls? as if justice was not demanding anything of us. These thinkers would have been staggered by John Rawls's argument, Rawls, the leading political philosopher of the last 40 years, his argument that a just abortion policy for America is that policy which respects the rights of everyone who's party to the argument about abortion, their right to be heard respectfully. Rawls already subordinating a fundamental issue of justice to a secondary or tertiary one, subordinating protecting persons' lives to civil discourse. And these people, and we should too, naturally reject President Obama's message on last year's anniversary of Roe versus Wade, when President Obama said, "We must continue our efforts to ensure that our daughters have the same rights, freedoms, and opportunities as our sons to fulfill their dreams." Now, the President spoke, utterly without irony, only, of course, about sons and daughters who survived the womb. Besides, no one's son has anything like the rights, freedoms, and opportunities of everyone's daughters when it comes to the life or death of their child in the womb. And Justinian, these thinkers going back to the 6th century, would have been horrified by the pettifoggery of the Roe Court, which set upon the foundational question about persons with the zeal of a clerk and with the charity of a highway robber. The Roe Court asked itself about constitutional persons, knowing that this was the foundational question, knowing that if the unborn counted as persons within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, the case for abortion would, this is the Roe Court's term, collapse. While Harry Blackmun and his confreres set about to resolve that through a feat of technical legal reasoning, impervious, and it would seem blithely indifferent to the truth of the matter about persons. This is the same court that seemed to rejoice. I take that back. It rejoiced and congratulated itself for not needing to resolve the difficult question of when life begins. This was a court that undertook to authorize the use of deadly force upon a class of beings, human beings, without ever concluding that the victims were not really persons. And note well, nowhere does the court in Roe, nor at any time since, has the Supreme Court said flatly, the unborn are not persons. The court tried, in other words, to suppress the foundational question, who counts as a person, as Dworkin, Rawls, Obama, and so many other people have tried to do. It's the great accomplishment of the pro-life movement, it's a great accomplishment especially of this organization, to have resisted this suppression, to have kept alive the spirit of justice, and to have promoted in season and out of season a willingness to face unafraid the demands of justice. The fruits of this effort, along with the revelations of neonatal and genetic science and some important legal successes, provide, in my judgment, a new opportunity now that is at hand to exploit a portentous, maybe fatal flaw in Roe versus Wade jerry-rigged legal edifice. This limitation arises in the heart of Roe, and it illumines the way to an eventual, hopefully soon, near, Supreme Court reconsideration of Roe on terms favorable to the pro-life cause. Now, the protagonist of this possibly epic Supreme Court reconsideration of Roe will not be a good Samaritan or heroic state official. He will be a bad man, one who has killed his own unborn son or daughter. A man like Scott Peterson, whose present address is death row, San Quentin prison. This protagonist's aim will not be the aim which has brought many thousands of people to D.C. to march tomorrow. This protagonist is no champion of human rights. He will simply want his conviction for what is generically called feticide reversed. But his constitutional arguments will nonetheless force the justices to confront, as they have never confronted before, the foundational question, who counts really as a person, the question they suppressed in 1973. Now, the protagonist could be Airman First Class Scott Boye, B-O-I-E. Boye married his girlfriend shortly after learning that she carried their child. But he was never happy about the pregnancy, and before long, he asked his girlfriend, now wife, to have an abortion. When she refused, Boye bought some misoprostol, an abortifacient commonly used in lawful chemical abortions. He ground the drug into a powder and secretly put some of it into his wife's food and drink on 4 separate occasions. She soon miscarried. After admitting what he had done during a recently recorded, or I should say secretly recorded, phone conversation with his wife, he pleaded guilty under the federal Unborn Victims of Violence Act, pled guilty to the lesser offense of attempting to kill his child. It was a plea bargain. He was dishonorably discharged and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Or our protagonist might be Gerardo Flores. By the time his girlfriend, Erica Basaria, discovered that she was pregnant with their twins, it was too late. Her physician said that neither he nor any other local doctor could safely perform the abortion both she and Gerardo wanted. Now, Basaria testified at Flores' capital murder trial that she asked him repeatedly to help end the pregnancy by stepping on her abdomen. He did so repeatedly. She, that is Basaria, even supplemented Gerardo's efforts by striking herself in the stomach every day. Now, none of it worked, at least immediately, but she later delivered stillborn twins. Flores was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Basaria was not prosecuted. Now, 38 or so states have enacted what, again, I'll generically call feticide laws like these since 1973. This effort, which I'm eager and pleased to note, was spearheaded by AUL, or coordinated by AUL, and especially by its longtime leader, Clark Forsyth. These feticide laws are a great credit to many, many people, known and unknown to history, but including AUL and Clark. The federal law is typical. Many of you know what it says in pertinent part, but some don't, so I will summarize. In pertinent part, Federal Unborn Victims of Violence Act says, whoever causes the death of a child who is in utero is guilty of an offense distinct, separate from any accompanying offense against the woman carrying the child. This separate offense is subject to the same punishment as would be the identical misconduct if it were committed against the unborn child's mother, which would be the same punishment as if the offense, the same misconduct, were committed against anyone else, me or you, or Austin Roos, or Clark Forsyth, and Bill Saunders. Now, of course, in Roe itself, and I should say that these laws are based, in a sense, in Roe itself. And this is why I call this aspect of Roe a flaw. Because Roe congratulated itself for not resolving the question of when life begins. It found a right to abortion by identifying certain detriments or distresses that a pregnant woman might face. But even in articulating a right to abortion on demand, the Roe court never said the unborn are not persons. They said, well, the state may not adopt what Roe called a theory of life, such that it overrides the demands placed upon pregnant women, or overrides the rights of the pregnant woman. But in Roe, and as many of you know, in Webster in 1989, and again in Casey in 1992, with not a word contradicting this since, the court has said repeatedly, apart from this immunity, you might say privacy, or cocoon, or liberty around that woman, the state is free to adopt, if you wish to call it that, a theory of life. The state is free to affirm that people begin at fertilization, that from the get-go, these persons have the same right not to be killed, and it's good against the whole world in exactly the same ways it's good against us, for us, with the one exception, the woman aborting. Hence, the solid constitutional foundation of all these feticide statutes. And I submit it might be the undoing of Roe, because Airman Boy, Gerardo Flores, and the many other defendants convicted of feticide make an equal protection argument against their convictions, to overturn their convictions. They say it violates equal protection of the law. It's unconstitutional to hold him accountable for what she is perfectly free to do. They say, in effect, but this is clearly what they're saying, I'm making the same choice, I have the same intention, commit the same act, cause the same harm, engage even in the same behavior, whether it's an abortifacient drug or stomping on somebody's stomach, and I can have the same motivation, and did, these men say. After all, the detriments, the court's word, the Roe court's word, which underwrote the abortion liberty, are not really about pregnancy, right? Only one of the 7 challenges the court identified or cataloged in Roe as the substance or the foundation for an abortion right had to do with the child in the womb, one of 7, medically diagnosable harm during pregnancy. All of the other reasons adduced in Roe for abortion liberty had to do with the anticipated burdens of raising a child. These were, now I quote Roe, maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by child care. There is also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child. And there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable, psychologically and otherwise, to care for it. The court also mentioned the stigma of unwed motherhood, but that's evaporated since 1973. And the remaining detriments are real enough, and despite the use of the word woman or maternity, none of them is gender specific. None of them, not even all of them together, would morally or legally justify any mother or any father or anyone else in killing a child who's already born. And all of these distresses or detriments can be presented to the father of a child as much as or more so than in the case of the mother. So Airman Boy, Flores, and the others who have been convicted of feticide say it won't do, and it violates equality, to declare that he, Boy, Flores, is never justified in seeking to avoid these harms by exactly the same means, by doing what she is never asked to ever justify, namely killing their child unborn. He and his peers argue that once the legislature has decided to treat the unborn as homicide victims, the law may not hold him responsible while completely exempting her for doing the same thing. It is not, and they readily recognize this and allow it, that the presence of the child within her womb, not his, makes no difference. It does. And so if the pregnancy itself threatens her life or her bodily health, then her abortion might be legally justified, if not morally justified. Even so, Boy and Flores and these guys say that the pregnancy difference itself has to be subjected to the same law, the same norms of justification and excuse. Pregnancy matters, but it has to be evaluated according to the same law that his act is evaluated according to. Similarly, all of the other detriments mentioned by the lower court. Now, I've already mentioned that the majority in Roe will congratulate itself for being philosophical idiots, or with no desire to be charitable in this particular way. Perhaps we can more charitably say being philosophically reticent, for abstaining from philosophy. And I mean by philosophy nothing highfalutin, just a matter of looking at reality and trying to reason to a conclusion about when people begin, which is actually not that hard to do, to be honest with you. But I also mean here now to say in conclusion a word about the, let's call them, without naming names, just call them the conservatives on the Supreme Court, this court now, who have been people and maybe a couple of them especially, who have been themselves philosophically reticent. There's a way in which judicial conservatism is identified with an aversion to what they would call judicial philosophizing, judges making value judgments, judges imposing, if you will, their policy preferences. So hold that thought. The conservatives on the court being not responsible for Roe, not at all, but rather being themselves philosophically reticent. I think it will be awkward then for the entire court to now take up the foundational question it has long suppressed. Who counts? Who's a person? When do people begin? But I think the justices actually have no feasible alternative. Airman Boy and the like raised equal protection challenges which go right through the personhood question. These challenges deserve a conscientious response. Now, the court's not obliged to take these cases. They can grant cert or withhold it, that is, deny cert. And you can run for a long time from the demands of equality, and maybe you can hide for a while, but I don't think you can hide indefinitely. Now, it may be scarcely imaginable, I think it's almost unimaginable, that the court now would declare, for the first time, flatly, the unborn are not really persons. They're not human life deserving respect. In truth, people don't begin until birth, and that these judgments, people don't begin until birth, the unborn are not persons, they're conclusive upon state legislatures and Congress. I think it's almost unimaginable that the whole feticide regime and everything that goes into it, all of the recognition, all of the judgments, all of the science that have given rise to the feticide regime, recognizing that people begin at fertilization, the court just pushing all of that over, revolutionizing this part of the law, well, it's scarcely imaginable. I think it's scarcely imaginable that the court could escape the dilemma presented by these feticide defendants by declaring, for example, the Act of Congress, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, unconstitutional. These are now permanent fixtures of our legal system. Sonograms, prenatal medical developments, DNA research, replenished common sense all show that these laws are well-founded. People do begin at fertilization. But to say scarcely imaginable is not to say quite unimaginable. And the pro-choice dogmatists on the court might yet cling tenaciously, that tenaciously, to abortion rights. They might venture into the philosophical deep and sweep away this latest threat to what they consider to be the non-negotiable demands of women's equality. So perhaps then the paradoxes of persons that I've described, the ones raised by the feticide cases in light of Roe, have greater purchase upon the court's conservatives, upon those justices who recognize the injustice of abortion and who have long regarded Roe as an albatross around their necks and as a stain upon the court. Now, these men profess varying degrees of faithfulness to the original understanding of constitutional provisions, and I will simply state flatly and defend, next time Bill invites me to defend it, that there is no doubt that the plain meaning, original purpose, and original understanding of the word person in the 14th Amendment, where no state shall deny equal protection of the laws to any person, there's no doubt that word referred to the entire reality. That is, the meaning of the Constitution in that particular instance, person, is the same as the reality of the matter. But again, that's the original understanding, and I think in this case, the originalism of these justices should call them to make what they might call a value judgment. But they've shown little inclination so far to do that in this case. Of course, the position of the conservative justices is that the Constitution is silent about abortion. One state can have pro-choice laws, another state can have pro-life laws. It just says the Constitution has nothing to do with abortion. I think that view is mistaken. But their characteristic philosophical reticence is usually well-founded. Not this time. Usually is not always. And if not now, when? When would it be right for these justices to step up and take on this question, call it philosophical? For abortion is not only the great civil rights issue of our time, it is the greatest human rights tragedy in America's history, and it is so by far. 55 million dead, since Roe and counting. That's 100 times more than all the Americans killed in battle during World War II. It is many millions more than all the Africans ever enslaved in America. And these 55 million were killed outright. They were killed before they could come to know a mother's love or a wonder at a sunset, before they could praise God, as even the slaves could and did.
We have, I'm watching a clock. I think we have time for a couple of questions if somebody wants to ask one. Ed, go ahead.
Professor, thanks. Professor, you've really touched on an issue that those of us who've been in the movement for a while know the struggles we've had over personhood. So I'm going to, since you mentioned me by name, please indulge me in the privilege of a multi-part question.
Permission granted, Ed.
Thank you. Is it possible, in your view, to enact, defend, philosophically, legally, laws that would restrict and even prohibit abortion without declaring the unborn to be persons or recognizing that under the 14th Amendment that they're considered to be persons, which I think is potentially a different issue. You could have legal personhood and then specifically what the 14th Amendment meant to cover, as you know, and I'm sure you've written about. So in other words, is that essential? I think there's a camp in the pro-life movement that has long said that declaration that the unborn are persons is not only necessary but is sufficient to resolve the whole issue. There's other camps that say it's not necessary and it wouldn't be sufficient, and that's been a tension within the legal side of the pro-life movement for quite a while. And then, of course, you know, what is it a legitimate? I think you're saying that it is a possible originalist understanding of the 14th Amendment that would include the unborn. Do you think that's the only legitimate reading of the 14th Amendment, or whether that's debatable? So I'm sorry for the multi-parts, but no. You've really raised issues at the heart of everything. Oh, and finally, a regime of laws against abortion, should they simply be fetal homicide laws that cover this situation, or do you think specific laws covering abortion would be necessary?
Well, they're all, thank you for your questions, Ed. They're all good ones. Let me take a stab at responding to a couple of parts of what I think you said. One is that I, for the moment, eschew discussion of tactics and strategy. So I'm not suggesting that personhood amendments are the way to go. I think actually in this particular climate, given our political and legal culture, they're probably too provocative and too clumsy. The other thing I would say about personhood amendments, which I think most of you must know, but perhaps not all of you do, are simply flat-footed declarations. One was recently attempted in Oklahoma, there's been one in Mississippi, but they basically just say, as a state constitutional amendment, people begin at fertilization and have the rights of other people from that point forward. What I would say about those efforts, besides I think they're provocative and so far have not been as successful, is what do they do that feticide laws don't do? And that maybe is the heart of my response to your question is, well, do we have to declare them persons? What can you do? Well, what do the feticide laws do? Let's ask Scott Peterson next time we can ring him up on death row and say, when do you think the law of California has decided people begin, Scott? Or Airman Boy. Our law is chock full of declarations of when people begin. And those declarations have the same meat and substance and effect when applied to you as applied to unborn children. I mean, I'm not really sure what else the law is supposed to do, because I think the central goal of the pro-life legal movement has always been to find a way to bring, or I should say assimilate, abortion to the ordinary laws of homicide. which means to bring the abortion decision under the governance of normal, that is, ambient principles of justification and excuse. You wouldn't quite say that the aim of the pro-life legal movement has been to eliminate abortion. It would be good if that happened, but I think that the goal has been to treat it like another form of homicide. But that would include applying principles of justification and excuse. So for the life of the mother, sure, that would be at least legally justified, if not morally so. But I guess my point is, I'm not sure what else should be done to make that happen that's not happening with the feticide laws. Now, you've got now the arbitrary block of Roe. And for that reason, you have written into the federal feticide law, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, you have an exemption or an immunity for the pregnant woman. But that now appears to be, what, more and more logically, and as a matter of justice and humanity, a derelict, an anomaly. And as one law professor who testified in favor, I think this would be 2004, of the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, I can remember very well what this particular law professor said, testifying in Congress. Well, if there's an anomaly in the law created by passing this Unborn Victims of Violence Act, it's an anomaly in Roe, not in this law. And I'm not really sure, in a way, I don't want to be heard to suggest implicitly, well, we've won. You know, the pro-life goal has been reached. We have justification principles clamped down in favor of the unborn, except for this huge exception, 1.3 million times a year. But the tools are there, and I think I do want to be heard to say, right now we're looking at power blocking the momentum of justice. I mean, the predicates and premises are in place. Now, power is in the way, and power is not to be trifled with, and it's no joke. But I think it's power at this point, just arbitrarily declaring, judges, justices, the president, this is what we're going to have here. And we're not going to argue with you anymore about persons. And of course, that's one of the great victories of the pro-life movement, really, is that they don't argue with us about who's a person anymore, right? When was the last time President Obama, just for example, among many others, took up that question in some kind of forum?
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Fascinating presentation. Oh, introduce myself. I'm Star Parker with CURE. These protagonists that you mentioned, perhaps I missed it in your presentation, are they making this case? First part. And number two, are you saying that in Roe they're not mentioning that a medical or doctor has to be present?
Oh, as to the second point, no, I'm not suggesting that. So that one of the cases, Gerardo Flores, where he and his girlfriend, Erica Basaria, seemed to be conspiring to produce a kind of crude abortion by stomping on the stomach. Now, she was not prosecuted, but in some jurisdictions, she could have been and would have been. I mean, what you're entitled to after Roe is to perform a lawful or be party to a lawful abortion. So in my own home state of Indiana, the law about abortion pretty much reads this way: all abortions are crimes, except, and then there's a long list of regulations where a woman with consent and voluntarily goes to a licensed place. So basically, the structure of the abortion law is that there should be no abortions, with this huge exception. But that's not necessarily true everywhere, and some feticide laws will immunize the woman completely. Sometimes they will more explicitly limit her just to pursuing a lawful abortion, that is a surgical abortion, let's say, so that Erica Basaria could have been prosecuted in some jurisdictions. But as to the first, these men, and there are many others, are challenging their convictions. Their convictions are always affirmed, and the laws, the feticide laws, are always affirmed. The courts recognize exactly what the problem is, what the threat is. They see that Roe is now exposed. And here's a situation where I am not charitable towards the judges in these cases who are affirming the convictions. That's not what makes me uncharitable. But rather, when they see what these men are saying about Roe and equal protection and them, and the norms of justification being applied to them as they should to her, they struggle, to put it very charitably. These judges, in case after case, the Flores case, Boy's case, the best example is Commonwealth versus Bullock, Pennsylvania case, a feticide defendant, Matthew Bullock. He says, you can't convict me unless you change the law so that she has to pony up and justify what she's doing. The court says, nope, we're just not going to do that. Arbitrarily suppressing the force, or evading the force of the challenge. And if you want to, not laugh, because that's inappropriate in this context, but if you want to have a funny feeling inside, read the concurring opinion by Judge Baer, B-A-E-R, in the Bullock case. And here's a man who knows exactly what logic, coherence, and justice require. He sees that Roe is maybe fatally exposed, and he simply, now I'm going to do from memory, Baer just says, well, the legislature is not going to undo Roe by playing word games in the feticide law. The law says people begin at fertilization, so that's a word game. But he says any attempt to use the feticide law in this case, or any other like it, to undo Roe, and here's his exact phrase, is unavailing. Okay, that's the judge's term, is unavailing. Now, I know what that means. He's saying, you ain't going to get away with this. We're going to block you. But there it is. It is being blocked. We're being blocked. But that's the nature of the counterforce. It is just force. Is unavailing.
Okay, go ahead. We've got time for one more.
Carol Grosset asking you about the word game, the difference between a human being and personhood. I debated pro-choice advocates, and they'll say, well, yeah, it's a human being. I mean, it has DNA structure like you and me, but it's not a person. Personhood is a metaphysical term.
Right. That's correct. I mean, that's correct. And sure, Roe, well, I don't know, Roe doesn't quite, well, leave aside whether Roe concedes it's a human being, but everybody now does, right? Everybody knows it's a human being. Left undisturbed and given a proper environment will become Ed Gaffney, for God's sake, the man next to you. But I mean, I suppose in effect, Roe did us a disservice, to say the least, by separating the human being from the person. And, you know, I've debated, maybe not as often as you have, but I've debated this issue. And the great problem in their position is to separate human beings and persons. And they want to say persons don't begin until much later than the human being begins. But they can't ever manage to do that and limit the collateral damage just to unborn people. Every time you make them identify, well, what is it besides the existence of the organism and the full DNA complement, we can see that the whole direction is to become like Ed Gaffney or Charmaine Yost. We can see all of that, and you agree with all of that. So what is it that's missing then that you say when it arrives changes the human being into the person? Let's say consciousness, sentience, the ability to have interests, to have projects. They have all sorts of possibilities, but they've never been able to establish that. They can't establish it convincingly for other reasons, but on a simple dialectical level, they can't avoid condemning some other folks, you know, walking around folks, whether they're mentally debilitated, whether they're sleeping, if you talk about consciousness, whether they're like infants. The problem with all of their arguments is that they can't get what they want, which is basically unborn human beings are fair game, at least for their mothers. But everybody else, basically, well, it's business as usual. We're all fine. Well, given their unfortunate attempts to separate person from human being, they identify person with some, effectively, subset of all of us walking around. I think the thing to do is for all of us to maybe stop buying green bananas if they have their way.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. I want to invite up Clark Forsyth and the legal panel. Thank Jerry again, gave us a lot of good things to think about. And I would just mention, you know, as Jerry was saying at the end, Johnny Erickson Tata, right there. You start defining some human beings out of the class of protected persons, then who knows? It puts everybody at risk. Where is Clark? Okay. I'm going to introduce Clark Forsyth. For any of you who've been friends of AUL or followed AUL, you know Clark. He's a senior counsel. He's served in all roles, really, at AUL. Very experienced and respected legal writer and thinker. And his new book that I want to mention for you will illumine some of the things Jerry was talking about in the Roe decision. It's a comprehensive, really, analysis of what went on behind the scenes, and it's called Abuse of Discretion, the Inside Story of the Supreme Court's creation of the right to abortion, and it'll be published by Encounter Books in September. Clark.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you all for being here for another distinguished panel. Their extended bios are in your materials, and I would encourage you to read them thoroughly. They're all very interesting. And I'll just give a few brief highlights before I give some introductory remarks. Dr. Laura Garcia received her doctorate in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame and has been a member of the Boston College Philosophy Department since 1999. Her recent publications include Authentic Freedom and Difference in a book entitled Women, Sex, and the Church, edited by Erica Bakayaki, which I would encourage you to take a look at, and Preserving Persons, published in a volume entitled The Contribution of John Paul II to Bioethics. She is currently editing a book of essays entitled Truth, Life, and Solidarity, Philosophical Implications of the Thought of John Paul II, and her lecture last year at Xavier University in Cincinnati entitled In Defense of Male-Female Complementarity will be published as part of the university's Ethics, Religion, and Society lecture series. Ed Whalen is president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in Washington, and he has advanced that organization and its influence under his stewardship. He's a former law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia after graduating from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and he is a leading contributor to National Review's online Bench Memos blog, where he writes my favorite blog. Helen Alvarez is an associate professor at George Mason University's School of Law, and she is a prolific writer of essays and very interesting and thought-provoking law review articles. She's been published in many leading law journals across the country. She's recently edited a book entitled Breaking Through, Catholic Women Speak for Themselves, and I'm looking forward to getting into a manuscript law review article for Villanova Law Review entitled No Compelling Interest, the Birth Control Mandate and Religious Freedom. But before they give their remarks, I need to give some context and explain how we got here today. 40 years after the Supreme Court's abortion decisions, they remain intensely controversial. In fact, I think by almost any objective measure, Roe v. Wade is the most controversial Supreme Court decision since Dred Scott, the 1857 decision which prohibited Congress's limitation of slavery in the Western Territories and heightened North-South tensions leading up to the Civil War. I mean, the hundreds of thousands of people marching tomorrow on the Mall are not there because of Gideon or Miranda or any other Warren Court decision. They are there, they have been there every year for 40 years for one reason, Roe v. Wade. Now, of course, what we call Roe v. Wade is really two cases from two states, Roe v. Wade from Texas and Doe v. Bolton from Georgia. These two cases were argued together, decided together, and issued the same day. But the Doe decision has been relatively and typically ignored over the past 40 years, despite its significant impact on abortion policy in the United States. And that has skewed academic understanding and public understanding of the impact of the two cases. Because the court said that Roe and Doe, quote, are to be read together, unquote. And in Roe, the court created this right from conception to birth for virtually any reason, but then suggested that the states could prohibit abortion after fetal viability, and here's the key phrase, quote, except where it is necessary for the preservation of the life or health of the mother, unquote. But then in Doe, the justices defined that health exception as, quote, all factors, physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the woman's age, relevant to the well-being of the patient, unquote. That's why health, uniquely, in abortion law means emotional well-being without limits. This health exception swallowed the supposed ability of the states to prohibit abortion even after fetal viability. And there are several more reasons why the justices have caused 40 years of turmoil and unrest in this country over the abortion issue. First, Roe versus Wade began as a mistake. The justices took two cases in April 1971 to decide the very obscure issue of jurisdiction between state and federal courts. And then, later in the year, a four-justice block decided to use the cases to eliminate the abortion laws. Justice Blackmun related this story to at least two people, and it's confirmed by the briefs in the cases, the justices' papers, and the oral arguments. In a letter to then Chief Justice Rehnquist in July of 1987, and that date is important because it was the summer before the Bork hearings began, and Chief Justice Rehnquist was worried about the court being shorthanded if the Bork nomination was not successful. He was concerned about the court being shorthanded in the fall, and Blackmun wrote to assuage his concern, and he wrote the following. He said, quote, "I remember that the old chief, Warren Burger, appointed a screening committee chaired by Potter Stewart to select those cases that could, it was assumed, be adequately heard by a court of 7. I was on that little committee. We did not do a good job. Potter pressed for Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton to be heard, and did so in the misapprehension that they involved nothing more than an application of Younger versus Harris. How wrong we were," unquote. Younger was that state-federal jurisdiction case. And that's how the justices ended up with two cases with no evidentiary record whatsoever about abortion or its risks or its implications. Second, there's reason to think that Roe was really an historical accident due to twin vacancies after the abrupt retirements of Justice Black and Justice Harlan within a week in September of '71 due to ill health. That flipped the balance of the Supreme Court in September of '71, and a temporary majority of 4 justices, Douglas, Brennan, Stewart, and Marshall, pushed to use the two cases to create a full-blown right to abortion. Third, the outcome in Roe versus Wade was driven by a medical myth that abortion is safer than childbirth. And you can read this in kind of between the lines in both Roe and Doe. But there was no reliable data in 1972 to justify this, and certainly there was nothing in any record. No existing obstetrical textbook in 1972 made such a claim. And again, there was no evidentiary record. But a review article that I think Professor Coleman mentioned earlier, published earlier this month in Scientifica, the online journal by Dr. John Thorpe of UNC Chapel Hill, explains why that medical myth that abortion is safer than childbirth is still nonsense today. Fourth, it was based on that medical myth that the justices proceeded to prohibit health and safety regulations in the first trimester, when 90% are done, and created the public health vacuum that we see in Kermit Gosnell's clinic in Philadelphia and Stephen Chase Brigham's clinics in Maryland and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And fifth, a month before the decisions were released, the justices arbitrarily expanded the right to abortion that they were creating from 12 weeks gestation to 28 weeks, a full 16 weeks, a full 4 months, and arbitrarily adopted a viability rule that was never briefed or argued. In fact, in 4 hours of oral argument in December of '71 and October of 1972, the word viability was not mentioned even once. As a result, Roe versus Wade is way out of line with international standards. Roe isolated the U.S. as one of 4 countries out of 195 around the globe that allow abortion for any reason after fetal viability, and those 4 nations are the U.S., Canada, China, and North Korea. Roe is way out of line with American public opinion, which supports abortion only in certain circumstances early in pregnancy. And American tort law and property law and criminal law, as Professor Bradley noted, have rejected the viability rule. The states have moved ahead with legal protection in most of these areas from conception. And a growing body of international data over the last 20 years suggests significant long-term harms, long-term risks to women from abortion that you heard about from our medical panel. More specifically, there's a growing body of international medical studies, statistically significant and peer-reviewed, that specifically find an increased risk of preterm birth after abortion, an increased risk of mental trauma, and an increased risk of breast cancer. Today, in 2013, it seems that the public authority of Roe is largely based on fear. The fear that by overturning Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court would make abortion illegal. But the irony is, if the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade today, abortion would be legal tomorrow, up to fetal viability in 42 or 43 states, for the simple reason that there is no enforceable legal prohibitions in 42 or 43 states. And as Bill mentioned, all of this I lay out more fully in my book, Abuse of Discretion, that will be published by Encounter Books in September. Those are the two cases that we deal with today. Professor Garcia?
I'd like to thank Americans United for Life and Bill Saunders in particular for the invitation to address you today. Also, to thank the other speakers that have gone before us and have really paved the way. In fact, taken away quite a bit of what I was going to say, so this will be a much shorter talk than it originally was, but I'm still grateful that those points have been made. I turned 18, so I realize I'm giving away my age, but so be it. I turned 18 in 1973. And so these 40 years since Roe versus Wade coincide with the 40 years of my adult life, those 4 decades. I would call it my mature life, but there are some people here who know me, so. And with your indulgence, I'd like to offer a kind of brief overview or characterization of the pro-life movement during those 4 decades. I realize this could just end up being autobiographical, but I hope not. I hope there's some resonance out there. And so I want to divide up into the 4 decades, and I'm calling them in order. The 70s, I believe the movement was blindsided. In the 80s, we became battle ready. In the 90s, we were besieged. And in the 2000s, or the aughts, bewildered. And then I want to say about the future of Roe that I think it will be brief. All right, so I hope to get to that shortly. In the 70s, I believe many of us were just blindsided by the decision itself, and then by how fast, how quickly it changed the cultural landscape, how quickly it revised our understanding of human life, of women, what women really needed, and so forth. All the state laws restricting abortion in any way were instantly null and void, of course. And this last Monday, on the anniversary of Roe, the Boston Globe had an article reporting that Massachusetts, of all places, still has an antiquated law that makes it a crime for a doctor to perform an abortion, punishable by up to 7 years in prison. So if Roe were overturned tomorrow, this law would take effect. You can imagine how frantic some people are getting here. They want to definitely get that one off the books. And abortion on demand here became, in the language of the court, in effect, a human right, a basic human right, predicated on the right to privacy, which sounds kind of serious and deep. Most of us feel that many of the things about our lives are private. I think Americans are particularly sensitive about that. And so if you could kind of fold it into that, it had a certain, sense to it, where it seemed to make sense to many people. I think also, at least for myself and maybe both sides of the debate, I think we're amazed, kind of blindsided by the immediate escalation, massive escalation in the number of abortions. Many people thought, well, legalizing it isn't going to make that much difference. How many women are actually going to seek an abortion? In 1973, and this is according to the Guttmacher Institute, there were about 745,000 abortions. In 1979, it was 1,500,000 abortions. So it more than doubled in 6 years, the numbers of abortions, making this a kind of major cultural shift, it seems to me. So in the 1980s, I think the pro-life movement kind of regrouped. I'm calling it the battle-ready decade, and came up with several strategies for combating Roe versus Wade and abortion on demand. One of them was to attack the wobbly legal reasoning behind that decision, and I think Clark Forsythe did a very good job of that, explaining that it had no real underpinning in the law, it had no real underpinning in philosophy or pretty much any other academic subject. It was just a kind of fiat decision. Secondly, of course, there had been powerful lobbying groups formed to support abortion. NARAL, Planned Parenthood, of course, many of them funded by the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. So the comment that Jerry Bradley made, the power is blocking the progress of the pro-life movement, that's very true, and money is power. Right? Certainly the political scene is very important to the legislative realm, but there's a lot of money behind abortion, and there always has been. There's been a lot of money behind eugenics programs and curbing population overseas and the like. But in response then, we found the kind of formation or the reactivization, you might say, of many pro-life groups as well. I mean, Americans United for Life had been around since 1971, so they were the old guard, and National Right to Life Committee founded in 1968. But in a way, you didn't hear the voices as loudly as you began to hear them, I think, in the 80s. The March for Life had been going on since '74 and has grown in numbers remarkably ever since. Human Life International, and evangelical Christians kind of came on board in the 80s, around 1980, I believe. So there was an attempt, at least, to organize as a movement, to raise money, to lobby, every front, right, philosophically, to defend arguments in favor of the humanity of the unborn child, and a lot of legal action, I think, as well, which is important. The Roe court professed a kind of ignorance about the beginnings of human life, and for a long time, I think, we thought we could easily counter this with education, right? It's easy. Beginnings of human life, just open your biology book, and if we sort of showed this to people, they would all get it, and that would kind of solve the problem. Well, it didn't, but we tried. Okay, there were a lot of efforts and a lot of, not just efforts, but a lot of activity there on educating the public. There was also an increasing callousness, of course, towards life in the womb as way it was described by the pro-abortion movement, very dismissive, sometimes as though it didn't exist. And so there was also a response to that on the part of the pro-life movement. Appeals to conscience, showing maybe descriptions of abortion, even pictures of aborted fetuses. Not everybody agreed with every one of these strategies, but the point was, I think, to reveal the face of the unborn child, to the humanity of the unborn child. In the 1990s, however, I think the movement felt besieged and a little bit overwhelmed, I suppose, by noticing that these strategies weren't making a whole lot of headway. And that was puzzling and also felt, it was a setback, you might say. I think the pro-life movement wasn't sure what to make of it. I think we became very fractured as a movement, in part debating over strategy. There was a multiplication, sometimes duplication of resources and that kind of thing. And the Casey decision put the abortion, the right to abortion, on a different footing, maybe a more foundational footing of liberty, appealing to liberty rights, also to the equality of women. The equality of women argument seems to me not as persuasive just because it's a kind of pragmatic thing that, Sandra Day O'Connor arguing that the equality of women requires access to abortion. Now, she's in her 80s now, so she was in her 40s when Roe v. Wade was enacted, at a time in her life when she was no doubt pushing her own career and so forth. And that generation, probably all the way down to mine, she's, fortunately, I can say older than me, so it's possible. We came from a generation that thought women really had to prove themselves to be the equals of men. The only way to do that was to be just like men in every respect. It never occurred to us that men should sort of take us seriously as women. Why would they? It was a weird kind of, lack of esteem, but also a kind of pushing for proving that we could be, reasonable facsimile of a man. And I felt that pressure myself. One of the first women, I suppose, in a while to go into philosophy. Along with that, of course, we had the National Organization of Women who, since then, have made abortion, I think, their main mission in life. That wasn't true in the 70s and 80s. You look on their website of now, key highlights, in the history of now. At first, it's all about equal pay, equal rights amendment, so forth, violence against women, what we can do about it. And then suddenly, it's more and more about two things. Abortion has to be defended as a basic right, and the gay and lesbian movement has to be defended. All right, so these two things kind of go hand in hand. 1 year it's progress on lesbian rights, the next year it's abortion rights. And I think by now, since there's so many other groups pushing gay rights and so on, this has become their one and only issue of the National Organization of Women. It's really, they practically worship abortion rights, Roe v. Wade. It's bizarre. It's an ideological thing. It is not necessarily a rational thing. They're just totally committed to it. Women have to have this, or they won't be able to compete with men and be reasonable facsimiles of men. It just isn't going to happen. All right, in response to that, I think positively, a lot of women took leadership roles in the pro-life movement. Up until then, we had seen some women, certainly at the helm, but we'd seen also a lot of men speaking for the pro-life view. We'd seen bishops and priests speaking for it. And I think we realized that if the National Organization of Women is going to present abortion as the real women's position, pro-choice and so forth, we had to have women who could articulate another view, another kind of pro-woman view. And thanks be to God for the women who took it on, Helen Alvarez being one of the main ones, Charmaine Yost and Marianne Glendon and many others that we owe, I think, a great debt to. Because, yeah, thank you. All right, now I think in the 2000s, moving along here, I call them the bewildered era, because this is when we realized that appeal to reason, like you had with Hadley Arcus, for example, it's just kind of obvious. The unborn child is a human being and has natural rights because it's naturally a human being. Every human being is a human person endowed with rights. That's a kind of default view, the common sense view. How could there be a difference between a human being and a human person? A person is something with a rational nature, so is a human being. Ergo, you're basically talking about the same category. This was just plain denied for 20 years, I think, in the debate. And then for 20 more years, it was declared irrelevant. So we finally won, you might say, on the personhood or the humanity, even the personhood of the unborn child. And then that didn't do the trick. People just declared that irrelevant. Yeah, it's a human being, but the woman's right to choose, to pick her career or her desires and so forth over the life of the child is just sacrosanct. We can't mess with it. And I think this is kind of astonishing for many of us. I call it bewildered. I was pretty much stunned, I think, by that development. Finally, then, what's the future for Roe? Well, I believe we have many reasons to be very encouraged and to believe that the future of Roe will be brief. I will try to state these as quickly as possible. First of all, I think the rise of social media. 3D videos of babies are appearing on YouTube. My niece sent me one, 2 or 3 minutes of a little baby kicking around in there, and to all of her friends. Right? Is that not a human person? Kind of looks like one. Here's our child, we're naming him this, and so on. In fact, I got a Christmas card this year from someone who gave pictures of each one of the kids, and the last picture was a sonogram picture with the name and all of that, our little boy on the way. Well, how long can Roe v. Wade and the denial of the rights of the unborn withstand these kinds of things? You look on Twitter, type in abortion on Twitter. Almost all the comments you read, and they're from young people, of course, all right? Not that many of us gray hairs are on Twitter. We don't tweet that much. So in the Tweeterverse or Twitterverse or whatever it is, almost all the remarks are pro-life. And I think that Jer has definitely pointed out the intellectual bankruptcy of the personhood scam. I call it a scam, and it really is. Philosophers are very aware of that, I think. I think having the Human Life Amendment back on the table, I was so stunned when they put that on the Republican Party's platform. I had not heard the phrase Human Life Amendment in years. Everybody always told me, I thought this would be a great idea, and they go, shh, don't be silly. That's never going to happen. So when I heard it was on the agenda, my mouth just fell open for several minutes. I was speechless. Practically a miracle in my case. I could not think of what to say. I was amazed. And also, I think there's a wonderful new feminism amongst the younger women today, a new feminism that is really very much compatible with what, in fact, almost exactly embodying what John Paul II called for as a different way of seeing it. And here I'd just like to quote in closing Naomi Wolf again, who in 2001, some years after the New Republic article, became pregnant unexpectedly and wrote a book, of course, being Naomi Wolf. She wrote a book about it. And in the 9th month, she was adamantly pro-choice at the beginning. In her 9th month of pregnancy, she says this, and keep in mind the background of the whole liberty thing. Gradually, I began to see things differently than I had before. I noticed in a different way the pointlessness of the traditionally male model of performance and autonomy at all costs. I came to feel that it was brutal to be content with a feminism that was compelled to fit into this traditionally masculine definition of accomplishment. True revolution, it slowly seemed clear to me, would come about only when we demanded that the world conform to our needs as women. Society must restructure itself radically to support babies and new parents, too. Stopping short of that meant that no revolution deep enough had been achieved. I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm especially grateful for the wonderful work that Americans United for Life does year in and year out. This 40th anniversary of Roe is, for me, a poignant and somber date. I moved to Washington, D.C. Some 21 and a half years ago to be a law clerk for Justice Scalia. I was a law clerk during the term that Planned Parenthood v. Casey was decided. The opportunity that the court had to set things right, and it flubbed it tremendously, and we're still paying the consequences. So it's amazing to me to realize that here we are 20 years after that, we still haven't gotten it right. But we, of course, know what is legally and morally right, and will continue to fight no matter what and prove wrong the court's strange belief in Planned Parenthood v. Casey that it was somehow calling the contending sides to give up the fight and to respect the court's illegitimate decision. Now, I would like to address the intellectual bankruptcy of Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and I'm afraid I may be repeating some of what Jerry Bradley had to say, including perhaps some of his jokes. I came in midstream, so my apologies if there is some repetition, though. I would like to think that when people are speaking right, it's natural that they reinforce each other. And of course, my bottom line point is it's well past time for all Americans, no matter what their views on abortion policy, to recognize that the abortion regime imposed by the Supreme Court in Roe and maintained in Casey should be dismantled. Now, Roe versus Wade is a frightening and lousy opinion. It borders on the indefensible. It's a verbal smokescreen. It provides essentially no reasoning in support of its holding. Those are not my characterizations. Those are not the characterizations of pro-life critics of Roe. Each of those statements and more are criticisms that supporters of abortion have offered of Roe versus Wade. But even these criticisms do not adequately explain why we're here today addressing a case that the Supreme Court decided 40 years ago, that it ratified 21 years ago, and that America's cultural elites embrace. The broader explanation I would submit is twofold. First, Roe versus Wade marks the second time in American history that the Supreme Court has blatantly distorted the Constitution to deny American citizens the authority to protect the basic rights of an entire class of human beings. The first time, of course, as Clark Forsyth mentioned, was the court's infamous 1857 decision in Dred Scott. There, the court held that the Missouri Compromise, which prohibited slavery in the northern portion of the Louisiana territories, could not constitutionally be applied to persons who brought their slaves into free territory. By its ruling, the court cast aside the efforts of the people through their representatives to resolve politically and peacefully the greatest moral issue of their age, and it made all the more inevitable the Civil War that erupted 4 years later. Roe is the Dred Scott of our age. Like few other Supreme Court cases in our nation's history, it is not merely patently wrong, but fundamentally hostile to core precepts of American government and citizenship. Roe is, simply put, a lawless power grab by the Supreme Court, an unconstitutional act of aggression by the court against the legislative powers of the American people. Roe prevents all Americans from working together through an ongoing process of peaceful and vigorous persuasion to settle our abortion policies and revise them as we see fit in our 50 states. Roe imposes on all Americans a radical regime of unrestricted abortion for any reason, all the way up to viability, and again, as Clark mentioned, under the predominant reading, though I think not necessarily the correct reading, of Roe's companion case, Doe versus Bolton, essentially unrestricted even in the period from viability until birth. And of course, Roe fuels endless litigation in which pro-abortion extremists challenge modest abortion-related measures that state legislators have enacted and that are overwhelmingly favored by the public. Provisions, for example, seeking to ensure informed consent and parental involvement for minors, and barring atrocities like partial birth abortion. Roe disenfranchises the millions and millions of patriotic American citizens who believe that the self-evident truth proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, that all men, all human beings, are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with an unalienable right to life, warrants significant governmental protection of the lives of unborn human beings. Now, I heard, or at least read, I didn't actually watch it, President Obama cite the Declaration the other day in his second inaugural, but he clearly does not believe that passage, and I think the rest of it is, of his speech is equally designed to move away from the Declaration rather than adhere to it. Now, so long as Americans remain Americans, so long, that is, as they remain faithful to the founding principles of this country, they will never accept Roe. Now, of course, I think it's fair to say now it's a big question whether Americans will remain faithful to our founding principles, and certainly you see that that the judges move further away. I think it would have been unbelievable 20 years ago to imagine that the Supreme Court might be on the verge of imposing a radical redefinition of marriage on the country. Yet many people, counting noses, expect that to happen by the end of June of this month. Of course, the second reason to explore Roe, to re-examine it, is the ongoing confusion that somehow surrounds the decision. Again, as Clark mentioned, leading political and media figures deliberately or otherwise routinely misrepresent and understate the radical nature of the abortion regime that the court imposed in Roe. You often still hear somehow, 40 years after the opinion, that Roe merely created a constitutional right during the first 3 months of pregnancy. There's nothing in Roe or Planned Parenthood v. Casey that can be intelligibly misread to support such a proposition. And of course, a more elementary confusion is reflected in the commonplace assertion that Roe legalized abortion. The court did not merely legalize abortion, it constitutionalized abortion. In other words, the American people had the constitutional authority before Roe to make abortion policy, and Roe deprived the American people of this authority. And I think that assertion that Roe legalized abortion bears on the surprisingly widespread misunderstanding that many people have of what the effect of a reversal of Roe would be. Again, Clark referred to this. I won't go further into it, but you have this strange disconnect in the polling on abortion, where I think largely because of the misunderstanding of Roe, there's a majority that favors preserving Roe. But when you look at the actual policies I'd like to see enacted, an overwhelming majority wants things enacted that can't be enacted so long as Roe exists. Now, let me turn to Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which I think in many ways is an even more appalling decision, if that's possible to say, than Roe, at least in some respect. I mean, the Planned Parenthood v. Casey is so breathtaking in its grandiose misunderstanding of the court's role that makes one long for the sterile incoherence of Roe. I'm sure, I gather I was coming in just after Jerry had mentioned this infamous passage in Casey. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. This provision is at the core of Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Now, we used to have a word for someone who believed that he had free reign to define his own concept of the existence, of meaning, of the universe, and the mystery of human life. That word is lunatic. It's a classic definition of what a lunatic is. Yet we have 5 justices on the Supreme Court embracing this proposition. Of course, the provision itself is incoherent. If I would like to define my own concept of meaning and of existence, of living in a country in which I didn't have a Supreme Court that spewed such gibberish, I couldn't do it. So, of course, this was a shell game for the court to conceal its own continued power grab. And we likewise see in that opinion more wordplay designed to camouflage what the court was doing. This notion that the majority isn't going to give in to pressures from those who want to see Roe overturned, as though there weren't far greater pressures in their own social circles to retain Roe. In any event, the court shouldn't be deciding what the Constitution means based on political pressures. It ought to be just getting it right. But of course, the court in Planned Parenthood v. Casey didn't even go so far, didn't even claim that Roe was right. Instead, under its confused notion of stare decisis, it thought it necessary to adhere to it, even if it was wrong, in order somehow to maintain the nation's confidence in the court as some sort of Nietzschean leader of our ideals. I encourage you sometime to read, if you haven't done so recently, Justice Scalia's dissent in that case, which I think is masterful, and that's, I emphasize, I have to take zero credit for it. Now, where are we now? Well, I, perhaps temperamentally, if I'm rarely accused of being an optimist, I'm not going to be an optimist now. The fact of the matter is we fight this fight not because we expect to win at any particular time, but because we know it is the right fight. We know that we fight this for our kids and grandkids. We fight this to restore a country that's that lives up to American ideals and that's worthy of those. We've had a couple big setbacks in recent years. I'm speaking of the confirmations of Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. We had 2 seats on the Supreme Court that were held in pro-abortion hands. They presented huge opportunities for marginal improvement on the court. And those are entrenched in pro-abortion hands, presumably for another 25 or 30 years. The court right now, it's fair to say at best, has a 5-justice, at best from a pro-life perspective, at best it's 5-4 against us, with Justice Kennedy and the 4 Democratic appointees. We know we have 2 justices who have made clear their willingness to overturn Roe, and 2 others, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, who have yet to have occasion to make clear their views on that fundamental question. We may well see another 1 or 2 Supreme Court vacancies during this second term of President Obama. If Justice Ginsburg is replaced, the status quo will be maintained, but worse, entrenched for her seat would be entrenched on the wrong side for another couple decades. If we God forbid, see a Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas step down, there's an opportunity for a dramatic swing, making the court even worse, not just on this issue, but a host of others. So, I think pro-lifers were alert to this and active in the presidential election in 2012. Obviously, we need to hope that in 2016 we can turn things around and make dramatic improvement. So with that, I think I will hand things off to Helen Alvarez. Thank you.
Way down. There we go. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank particularly Bill and Clark. And I go to a lot of academic conferences as a professor, but I never hear this much reason in one brief time, I have to say. And also, I would pay the price of admission to hear Laura Garcia try not to confuse people with philosophy, but still manage to convey truth to us, and to hear Ed Whalen use words like lousy in public, because he's so refined in his speech. Yes. So what I would like to do is to think about another possible future strategy that would put pressure on the law respecting abortions. And remembering that what we have done, and I guess I've been at this since about the late 80s, working first in the legal office for the bishops, then the pro-life office, was that we were trying to remind people what they were doing when they were doing an abortion. And it really struck a chord with me when Laura said, we thought, we tell them the facts. I used to show up at interviews with the media with embryology textbooks and think that that would help, because we knew that William Buckley had it right when he said the problem with abortion rights is abortion. And we thought, okay, we've got this. That didn't work, and we were flummoxed. I would like to think now with you about the possibility that instead of reminding people what they're doing when they do abortion, we begin to remind people what they're doing when they're having sex, okay? That I think we need to remind them that sex is not tennis, as they say in the movie Friends with Benefits, right? In fact, Planned Parenthood has taken all the fun out of sex. I mean, for them, it's like tennis, but it's grim, and when you're done, you roll over and you check and see where you can get your emergency contraception that morning, because you'll be in a panic if you don't. We have to have people reflect, religious or not, that somehow the person who put sex together with babies could have put it anywhere. The Creator could have done it anyhow, anyway, but somehow it's here. And so I'm not saying we're going to get as far as John Paul II's Love and Responsibility, where he talks about thinking about potential partners, lover, spouse, as parent. You're going to be the father or the mother of my child. I'm not suggesting we can go from 0 to love and responsibility in a heartbeat, but I think we could move a good bit in that direction. I call this the demand side of abortion. So I want to first, I'm from George Mason, right, law and econ people. So I'm going to first talk about the supply and demand sides of abortion. Then I'm going to talk about how it is that I think we could make some progress on what I'll call the demand side. And then I'll talk a little about how we might do it and reasons for hope there. First, with respect to what we've been doing for a long time, mostly, not completely, we have been doing the supply side of abortion. And AUL in particular is doing these fabulous laws on putting pressure on abortion clinics to close, to rethink, to be regulated so that they couldn't possibly keep up with actually doing healthy things in their clinics like other health clinics have to do. You also have AUL and the Susan B. Anthony list and others, Lila Rose, Live Action, going after Planned Parenthood, the most disturbing, don't even get me started, purveyor of everything that is wrong about women and life, and going after the supply side of abortion there. Operation Rescue, which is not your mother's Operation Rescue, it is not people with bullhorns. It's people watching patiently outside of clinics and getting them closed and alerting state regulators and the CDC, who pay no mind to deaths or injuries at these clinics, really, that something is going on there. So the supply side is really being pressured. Now, there is also some pressure on the demand side already, right? The demand being women's wanting it, or somebody wanting and demanding abortion. The marvelous ultrasound laws, I noticed, Charmaine, in your debate the other night on the NewsHour, which was so well done, the NARALs, the transvaginal ultrasound. I'm like, I'm eating dinner, but they want to make it seem harsh and awful and intrusive, and that's what they call it. We're showing them a picture of their child. Informed consent, crisis pregnancy centers. These are appealing to the woman not to demand the abortion. But still, our abortion numbers are still really high. They're really high. And we know there was a decline during the 90s, but they have now either stayed pretty high or pop up occasionally, but stay high. And it seems to me that the explanation is as a boatload of law and economics literature has it that when you put together, and we could go on about this, so the seminal article was in 1996, but there's been tons of literature since, Duke, George Mason, Penn, et cetera, that when you change the sex mating and marriage markets to make the price of sex low and the availability of escaping pregnancy so that the weight, I call it the unbearable lightness of sex. The weight of sex is no weight at all. It's tennis. Then there is a higher demand for premarital sex, and so we have seen an increase in the rates of non-marital pregnancy, non-marital sex, non-marital births, and abortions since the widespread introduction of contraception, okay? And there's no reason to think this is going to end. Now, the people who put out the articles that show this, in some cases, particularly the seminal article by Nobel Prize-winning economist George Akerlof, his wife, Janet Yellen, who's a Federal Reserve chairman out in California, have said, well, no, we still want to keep abortion and contraception obviously very legal, but they suggest, you know, just more and more government programs to make it more available, thus the HHS mandate. And they're also suggesting something that you really, and we really ought to keep our eye on, we are already, but even more so, is the acronym for it is LARCs, right? Long-acting reversible contraception. Many of these have the potential to act as abortifacients. And then emergency contraception, obviously the FDA's own and the pharmaceutical companies' own packaging, we know that it can act in the case of certain women at certain times in their cycle as abortifacients because it takes the life out of an embryo. Now, this is their strategy going forward, is LARCs. And you may have noticed that when the HHS mandate came out, if you read the report supporting it, a part of it, that report kept saying, if we could just get more women on long-acting reversible contraception. And then what a surprise, the St. Louis study comes out just in time for the HHS to read it and say, look, they fed these women more contraception, it was free, they used it, the abortion rate went down. They took a poor population of inner-city St. Louis women. They visited them 7 times, told them, swallow this, it's free, and voila, they sterilized them for 3 to 5 years with long-acting, by the way, it takes a surgeon to get it out, contraception, and the abortion rate went down. Now, even setting aside the moral hazards of this, right, the temptation to use it among the poor, minority populations, immigrants, that's what they did before when Norplant was invented. The other aspects of this, of course, of that in those populations where it has been distributed, it drives the abortion rate up, not down. The British studies, the Spanish studies show that girls' premarital pregnancy and abortion rates tended to go up, not down, okay? So, but that, I'm telling you, is coming in the future. It's not going to solve our abortion numbers, but that's what they want. How are we going to deal with this, in addition to the government promoting abortion, long-acting reversible contraception, to abortion being legal? How are we going to deal with this when nobody really countenances this evidence that what may work at an individual, contraception, long-acting reversible contraception, drives abortion rates down? That's what people think. On a social level, it always drives them up. How are we going to grapple with this? In addition to the fact that we have all of these environmental, cultural factors, the cheapening of sex. I mean, when women are dressing as vaginas at the DNC and that the press thinks that's a good thing, when Lena Dunham puts out an ad for the Obama re-election campaign and says, compares voting to him being like good sex and gets away with it, when the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, I'm sure you've seen, most of you, they're incredibly revolting videos where a very handsome African-American guy with a glass of scotch and a rose, in very sexy voice in a very dimly lit room, toasts Roe. Sort of, it looks like, if you turned the sound up, it looked like he was inviting you to have sex with him, but really he's just toasting Roe versus Wade, baby, which he says 100 times. When the president, when the National Women's Law Center, when Planned Parenthood is defending the HHS mandate on the grounds that it will allow people like Sandra Fluck, or I was on programs like Diane Rehm, or doing dueling editorials with Planned Parenthood, and they're saying it's because their unmarried daughters really need 365 days a year of contraception because otherwise they'll get pregnant. When sex is this nothing, how do you deal with this? How do you address what the other side believes is what creates the need for abortion and can't be done away with? The fact that all these women are going to be engaging in this precise sex mating and marriage market as we have it, getting pregnant, and according to the world standard of success, then needing not to be pregnant. Well, I do think we have to lay out the facts about the sex mating and marriage market that we're in. And in doing so, I have to tell you, I think we're not in a bad position. I mean, anyone who keeps up with the covers of Atlantic Monthly or pieces in Slate and Salon or the Huffington Post or some other marvelous authors out there, women, young women, talking about what it's like out there in the marketplace for sex mating and marriage will tell you that they're not happy really with the unbearable lightness of sex. And that they actually would like, and this will get me crucified, my feminist card from the 80s, which I still carry in my wallet, will be removed and burnt in the Capitol. I think women would like to get married a little younger and have their children a little younger, so sue me, okay? I just do. And what Naomi Wolf said at the end of her piece is true. That will take away my feminist card. When the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists put out a statement to the effect that your fertility starts to decline in your mid to late 30s, women ripped the signs out of the Metro and burned them. Yale University, in their own alumni magazine, just did a piece on women coming to doctors at Yale at 42 and saying, I'm done, I'm at where I need to be in my career, I can have a baby now. And they're saying, I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you. You've got like a 3 to 5% rate now. And some of them, were shocked. I think we need to have this frank conversation that what Naomi Wolf said is true. And nothing, Jennifer Roback Morse, I don't know if you know her, but she writes gorgeously about the culture accommodating us better. How might the law help us in this, in addition to this kind of cultural conversation online, with all our networks, in our churches? How might the law help us here? I've written an awful lot about this in a paper I called Beyond the Sex Ed Wars. And I propose a few things, and I'll have a few minutes left to conclude briefly on these. One is we have to take away the bad stuff in the law, where the law says things like unprotected sex makes babies. Oh, wow, a failure of technology manufactures human life. I thought sex made babies. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. We need to reconnect it in people's minds, that what you are doing has meaning. I think both men and women would appreciate it if we put a little bit of the meaning back into it. Now, of course, we'd have to defeat the porn industry alongside of that, okay? But we'll work on that too. But I'm just saying, we need to put this back together. We have to suck the bad stuff out of the sex ed as it's currently being done. I talked about this in the article. We have also to absolutely go against something like the HHS mandate, not just with a call for religious freedom, but also with frank discussion of how the government has it all wrong on women's freedom. And they have it, they're simplistic, they're empirically wrong, they're culturally wrong. Same-sex marriage is another arena where sex as procreative is attempted to be utterly demolished, and that is part and parcel of our portfolio. I think we need to put good content back into sex ed, if we could get that far. And of course, we need to reform our marriage laws regarding entrance and exit, our divorce laws, waiting periods for getting married, all of these things, so that we put sex, marriage, and the well-being of children together in one place. Bring marriage back onto the horizon as a safe place to go, to have your children, and to be stable with them. So in conclusion, this is a revolution I'm talking about, but a revolution is needed. And I think there's a lot of women ready for it. And I think men would be happy in the long run, even though they won't believe me in the short run. We have to take a revolution. And I like to call Planned Parenthood in the Obama administration the man. We have to take it to the man. What is the man? The man is the very powerful set of voices who tells you what reality is, even though they're lying. They pull all the levers, they have the money, they have the agencies, and they've got the government right now, they've got the media, the entertainment industry, and the academy. We have to engage in a revolution against the man. We have truth on our side. People think this is difficult, it's true, but I don't actually think it's been tried yet, so don't call it too difficult to do. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know anything I'd enjoy more than a 2-hour dinner with Ed and Laura and Helen with a good meal and a couple bottles of wine, but we've only got 15 minutes, so let's start with some questions. Yes.
Excuse me. If you'd introduce yourself.
My name is Henry Patrikas. I've got a question. Ed Whalen brought up the subject about lunacy. And I'm wondering, what's the prognosis for changing our law schools, which are putting out lawyers and judges who feel that the convenience of one human being outweighs the life of another scientifically proven living human being, just because that human being is in the womb? They have either a severe ethical lapses, somewhere has gone on in their brains, or a mental illness, including, I'd say, insanity, lunacy, which you said. What's the prognosis for changing that?
Since Helen's actively teaching, let's start with her.
Oh, thank you. Yes. It is definitely the case that in the academy there is a tendency for law schools, law professors to all sing off the same, we're all going to use Ed's word, lunatic set of talking points. I will tell you a couple things I've noticed. Feel free to counter me, anybody. The issue, which may not speak its name anymore in terms of people being on a sort of pro-marriage, pro-child side anymore, is the same-sex marriage issue. That's the tough issue. I have found it, and Jerry, maybe you have something on this. I have found you're not quite as persona non grata if you're pro-life now as you were 20 years ago. Jerry's nodding his head in agreement. We're not as lunatic as the people who apparently are taking the wrong side of the same-sex marriage issue from law professors. So they went so out on a limb that we started to look okay. The other thing is I'm at George Mason Law, and I would beg to differ, because one of the things that at George Mason we really value is data and empirical proof. And that's why I love the place. And not every law school values data. Some of them value, theoretical angels dancing on a head of a pin kind of scholarship. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but not in the legal arena. So, but changing that requires the National Legal Association, conferences like this where lawyers get to know each other, and we meet at conferences and we feel strengthened together because we have friends at other law schools, and then some of us are going to have to be willing to take deanships at schools in the long run, which is a painful, painful path, but some of us are going to have to do it.
Well, the culture of the legal academy is, I think, entirely deranged. And there is this sycophancy where people simply can't say, I disagree with you for these 3 reasons. Instead, it has to be, your paper has transformed my understanding of this issue, and I'll be forever grateful to you. And then let me just add 3 points to it. But people cannot speak candidly. And of course, well, I'll mention you had this recent New York Times op-ed by a Georgetown law professor that got a lot of attention. This is Louis Michael Seidman, who said, forget the Constitution, we should just enforce those parts we care about and ignore the others. And people were sort of scandalized. But that's what legal education has been for 30 or 40 years. He was just saying, candidly what everyone else is doing. So I don't know, I'm hoping that maybe somehow economics can play some role in transforming the law schools, but I'm not hopeful. I would just like to take the opportunity to dissent from one point that Helen made. I think she was being very unfair to tennis players in comparing the modern concept of sex to tennis, and I think tennis players can be counted on to know whom they're playing with.
Yes.
I'm Mary Ham. I work for the Archdiocese of Washington with Hispanic Family Life. My question goes a little bit to Laura for talking about the bewilderment of the 90s. It seemed to us, I was working in the pregnancy care movement at that time, it seemed like the pro-choice people had changed their strategy, that they were no longer focusing on abortion, but they were going after contraception, trying to make us seem, far-right radicals and weaving contraception into every discussion and catching us unprepared for that battle. And the other thing is that they had all along been using what I would call emotional intelligence for making their arguments, making arguments based on, you know, the poor girl who's whatever circumstances she's in, and abortion is the magic pill, where we kept going at it with the viability of the child, or the reasoned arguments, or the legal arguments, and we needed to change and meet the culture where it was at, making our arguments more based on emotional issues. Can you answer to those two issues? And Helen also.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what the two were. What was the first one again?
That they switched to contraception from
Oh,
abortion.
they did, yes, they did press that pretty hard, and the idea was to make it seem like anyone who was opposed to abortion was obviously opposed to contraception in general. And you notice how those two got kind of mushed together in Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion about people, well, in that opinion of Casey, where women have made their decisions based on the availability of abortion should contraception fail. You have to have this backup. You have to have absolute control over whether you, well, not whether you are pregnant, but some extent, but whether you continue, as they put it, continue the pregnancy. I always thought that's by itself an odd thing. You don't have to choose to continue your pregnancy. If you don't do anything, it continues, right? The baby keeps living, okay? So to say, are you going to continue, makes it, basically it's asking, are you going to take the life of your child? Terminate the pregnancy, which can only be done by terminating a child. So they kept winning, you might say, on the rhetoric there. And I think that maybe pro-lifers were reluctant to take on the question of contraception, as Helen has just pointed out, to ask whether or not even that introduction of sort of widespread use of contraception was really as beneficial to women as it originally seemed. I think now we've seen a lot of negative consequences of, certainly of abortion, but of contraception generally speaking, because all of this has put the burden now on women. If you become pregnant, it's your problem. The males feel no responsibility whatsoever. Possibly they'll pay for your abortion, which seems very generous to them. But it has wrecked relationships between men and women. There's no more dating. There's no more any way of getting to know a man other than you just jump in the sack, and of course you don't get to know each other that way either. So it's just alienated the culture completely. It's sad. It's very sad to see the situation on college campuses, for example. And the appeal to emotion, the appeal to the woman who was very visible, right, very desperate and the like, that was hard to counter, because the idea would be to show the desperate situation of the child who has no defenses here. And that would be hard to do. I mean, there was the Silent Scream movie and so forth, but people found that, I mean, basically they could ignore it. The media could suppress it. It was easy for the powerful, right, the media, the players, to just push that away. I found, oddly, this most weird, you might say, totally reversal of that in this article in the New Republic, just December 31st, where there was description, I won't tell the whole story, of a woman who wanted an abortion, and she couldn't afford one, whatever, and so she went online illegally and ordered abortion pills, abortion drugs, and she took them thinking she was 14 weeks along. And it turned out she was 5 months along. And sure enough, she delivered a little girl who was perfectly formed, face recognizably resembling the mom, hair, a little daughter. Now, oddly, think about it. You do this, I mean, this might undermine chemical abortions, it seems to me. You do the abortion, and then you end up with the corpse, basically, of your baby. Now what to do? Do you just throw it in the garbage? I mean, she couldn't figure out what to do. She sort of saved it for a while. She couldn't think about what to do. And the article was about all these other ramifications and so forth, but at the very end, the writer says, she asked the woman this question, what do you want more than anything else? And the woman said, I want a proper burial for my baby. Now, to me, that's moving, all right? Why do you want a proper burial? Because it's not just a thing and so forth. I think that as pro-lifers, we need to sort of, take an interest in these stories and be able to present the kind of sad face of abortion. It is not it's not a triumph. It's not a thing to celebrate or to toast. Right? It's very sad. And fortunately, we have, at least in response to the damage caused by abortion, we have Project Rachel, American Victims of Abortion. We are trying, at least as much as we can, I think pro-life people are trying to help rescue, help heal the pain in the hearts of so many women. We have a sad culture, especially I think my generation and older, a very depressed, sad, discouraged group of women. And it's just rampant. One article said, sort of celebrating this, well, it's as common as everything. 1 in 3 women will have an abortion by the age of 45. And, I mean, my reaction was, my God, what have we done? What have we become? All right, so I think we have to at least, you know, put those things out there. And it's odd that someone would write this with such a happy, kind of breezy thing. So see, abortion's no big deal. It's common. It's just part of reproductive health, right? Which is a euphemism and a weird way of phrasing abortion, right? So truth in advertising, very important. Younger women asking, why do you have to choose between your career and a child? Why do you have to choose between marriage and family and education? This shouldn't be the case. And that's a good question. I think in the 70s we didn't ask that. We just assumed we did have to choose, right? Which is too bad. There was an article I remember reading, Motherhood, the Annihilation of Women. Like, oh my gosh, it's one or the other. Either you're a mother and you're annihilated as a woman, or you got to set motherhood aside. You want a 20-year moratorium on having kids. Talk about lunacy.
Helen, do you want to?
I don't want to run over the time anymore. Do you?
We have a few minutes.
Oh, okay. You know, the question recently that is very pressing that Mary raised is the attempt to write off pro-life people as lunatic fringe on the contraception question, which is very tricky, right? Because Catholics have this teaching. Pro-life movement has a lot of Catholics in it. You have guys like the philosophy professor Badzuski, or Protestants writing books like Open Embrace, or Alan Carlson. I think he wrote that book, Godly Seed, where they're talking about struggling with the question. And to me, I don't think we have to answer the all or nothing question, and not to dodge like a Supreme Court justice at a hearing who's going to say, hey, Roe's going to be with us, I'll pass on that question about where I stand. But the federal funding of contraception and state funding is going to be with us. Presently, the question as it's structured is actually in our favor, because the question is, will we wipe out all resistance to a contraceptive mentality? Will we wipe out a witness to institutions saying, we'd like to think about it another way? All we're asking for is to propose the empirical data about its failure to resolve all kinds of questions. Women aren't getting better work-life policies, colleges aren't accommodating us, our student loans aren't going down, letting us marry earlier, et cetera, because contraception has flooded the marketplace in the last, 50 years. It hasn't solved things. It's driven the abortion rates up, sexually transmitted infections rates up. I'd like to present that data, and we also, frankly, I'd like to go all the way to the finish line and present a very positive, generous picture and exhortations about life with children and its ultimate happiness. There was this fabulous article. It was an African-American woman who was attacked. This sounds terrible, fabulous article, but she was attacked in a parking lot and beat off the attacker. And she screamed as she's beating him off. Then she gets up and runs after him. I have not finished my life yet. I have not gotten married. I have not gotten children. You go away. And I love that, because I thought that women need to be a little bit more directive about, we'd like to do this. We would like to have the law do this for us. Contraception hasn't done it. Might we have this other voice that is a child positive? Let's rearrange some things around the path and structure of women's lives, their fertility, their interests in doing justice at home and justice at an office. The HHS mandate, to me, implicates this. Contraception's a fact out there. All we want is to be allowed to live, to speak about another way, a more child-friendly and woman-friendly way.
Thank you. Please thank our panelists.
Thanks. Good job. Thanks. That was great.
Well, I am so very glad to look out across this room and see how many of you have stayed with us here to the end of our session today, because it really is my deep honor to have the opportunity to introduce Bill Kristol to you. I am quite positive that you are all very familiar with his work, probably through his wise and witty appearances on Fox News, which always bring me back into the room, Bill, when I've wandered off to do other things. But I think it's particularly lovely to be able to come and have this opportunity to hear from Bill here at the end, particularly in the context of having just finished talking about the overall intellectual disregard that the other side has for a pro-life argument, because Bill, of course, has impeccable credentials as a leading public intellectual in our country today. His resume is long and prestigious, with serving as the Chief of Staff to Vice President Quayle in the Bush administration and serving in the Education Department. I'll never forget one time wandering around one of the lovely old bookstores in Harvard Square and looking up and seeing Bill Kristol there, and he said he was up for a few days teaching at Harvard. So his intellectual credentials are impeccable, and why I was so very pleased when he agreed to come address us and finish out our day is, while I know Bill to be a very deep and committed pro-life thinker, that's not where his status as a public intellectual has been necessarily grounded. And so I just very pleased that this rounds out our day of hearing from someone who is very committed to our issue, but can bring us to a close today in looking from a 30,000-foot perspective. We've asked him to address the future of the pro-life movement. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bill Kristol.
Well, thank you, Charmaine. That was a very kind, overly kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I will try to be brief. I don't know that I honestly have much to add. You've had an excellent program. I caught the last half of that panel. I missed the risque joke between Helen and Ed, whatever that was. I'll have to get one of them to explain it to me later, but it seemed tantalizing, you know. And I actually thought, I'm so wrapped up in all these, there's so many fights going on now in politics, I thought Helen's story about the woman being assaulted in the parking lot was going to end with her pulling out her semi-automatic rifle and defending herself, thus vindicating the Second Amendment. But as I'm getting all the Obama administration assaults on all these different rights confused, so it shows I'm too much in the middle of all these fights. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I wanted to be here precisely because I'm not, you know, a pro-life activist. I've been, I hope, a pretty reliable friend and ally of the pro-life cause, and certainly have made the case for it, and worked with many of you in this room when I worked for Bill Bennett at the Education Department, and then much more really when I worked for Dan Quayle in the first Bush administration, when we had a lot of tough fights, and worked with you guys on upholding various vetoes of the first President Bush, made the case within the White House, which with Dan Quayle, tried to help him make the case, which we really lost, really a very sad moment, honestly, in retrospect, when President Bush appointed David Souter rather than Edith Jones to the bench. I think I'm not revealing any secrets that in 1990 that Dan Quayle was the one person in the very senior ranks of the White House who strongly made the case for Edith Jones, and got overruled, and that helped affect, in a bad way, I'm afraid, history. Also very involved in, on the other hand, the good news was I was slightly involved in making the case for Clarence Thomas and defending him when he came under assault when he was nominated in 1991. So it's nice after those years in government. At the Weekly Standard, obviously we've published many things on this issue, both reporting pieces on the successes and also the frustrations of the pro-life movement, and advocacy pieces, obviously, on the issue itself. I'd also attempted to publish, George Weigel and I did one piece together many years ago now, a sort of strategy piece on how to make the case and how to advance it incrementally, but in a principled way. That's something AUL's thought a lot about and done a lot of work on. So it's nice to be here. As I said, I don't know that I have much to add to what you've already heard. But maybe I can say a couple of words on where we are. I guess it's been 4 decades. It's hard to believe since Roe v. Wade. That was my senior year in college, I remember, and I remember hearing about the decision and expressing the opinion in a government class at Harvard that it seemed like a ridiculous opinion, actually, just totally ungrounded in the Constitution, and also I thought would result in bad policy, but as a matter of constitutional law. And that didn't go over so well in the class at Harvard I was in. I taught con law at Penn a few years later, and I tried to be fair, obviously, in the classroom, but I made clear that that was my view. I agreed with Justice White in dissent, and that wasn't the majority view there either. I actually think one of the good news stories, in a way, over the past 4 decades is the degree to which, despite the law schools, as people were saying before, and what's taught there, it actually, no one really makes a serious intellectual defense anymore of the argument in Roe, or for that matter, I would say of the argument in Casey. It's just there's too much inertia, and it's too difficult, and it would take too much courage, and there haven't been enough pro-life presidents consistently to appoint justices to overrule it. But in a certain way, the progress on the intellectual front has been very impressive, much more than anyone would have predicted, honestly, I think, back in the mid-'70s, or for that matter, in the mid-'90s. Well, I mean, one forgets with Casey, they really thought they had shut down the argument, basically. That's explicitly the argument in the plurality opinion, right? That, okay, enough of this arguing. It's been disruptive to have this debate in American politics, so we're the Supreme Court, we're deciding it, and could everyone please be quiet? And that really didn't work too well, which is a credit to America, I would say, honestly, and a credit to many people in this room. So there is good news. There's also, deep frustration, obviously. I know I feel it, and people in this room who've devoted so much time to this cause, I'm sure, feel it more intensely in the limited progress that's been made, and in the prospect of the next 4 years, which isn't entirely a happy one, at least on the federal legislative level, and probably on the federal judicial appointment level. Some things can be done, and certainly more could probably be done in the states, as many of you know. I thought I might organize my brief remarks, and they will be brief, around sort of two themes. And they were suggested to me by actually the funeral service for Judge Bork, for Bob Bork, almost exactly a month ago, actually, in McLean, Virginia. Maybe there were a couple people in this room who were there, but at the funeral mass, they had, of course, a program, and on the back there were some quotations from John Henry Newman and from Thomas More. And two of the quotations from Thomas More, I'm not sure if they were selected by Bob or by Mary Ellen, or maybe they were favorites of Bob's, I'm not sure. One of them, and they're both really wonderful quotations. One is, what you cannot turn to good, you must at least make as little bad as you can. What you cannot turn to good, you must at least make as little bad as you can. And if any of you knew Bob Bork, you would know that that would be one he would like a lot, because he was not a wild optimist, I would say, about improving things a lot, but he was a believer that maybe you could make things as little bad or as less bad as you can. And the other quotation from Moore is, you must not abandon the ship in a storm because you cannot control the winds. You must not abandon the ship in a storm because you cannot control the winds, which I think was, and Bob, I think, thought that reflected his tough decisions he made when he took over the Solicitor General, the Attorney General position, the acting Attorney General position in the Nixon administration. Obviously, he thought it was the right thing to do for the country, knowing it would damage his own future politically or in public life. Certainly didn't make him more popular when he went back to Yale Law School to have not quit along with the others who quit after the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. And Bob really was, of course, a man of principle, never abandoned his ship, and that's maybe why he wasn't confirmed in 1987, because unlike every Supreme Court justice nominee since, he didn't dissemble, in a word that's probably too harsh. He didn't refuse to say what he thought or refuse to defend positions and opinions he'd previously held. But if you take those two quotations from St. Thomas More, I do think they sort of give some guidance, perhaps, to all of us. One is, if we can't do good, we should at least make things as little bad as we can. I think that's a lot of what people will have to spend the next 4 years working on here in Washington. I wish it were different, and I wish we could look at great advances in federal legislation and executive branch and executive orders and in judicial appointments, but for reasons I won't dwell on, I think it's pretty obvious that that's unlikely. I do think it's still important, though. Really holding the line and winning what small victories one can is underrated, I would say, generally in politics. Because if you then, if you start from a position, it's like a football playing, if you can hold the other team reasonably and start from the 35-yard line, the next time you have a chance to advance the ball instead of from the 10-yard line, it really makes a difference in your ability to make progress. And I think this is a moment where people just need to not get discouraged if possible, hold the line as much as possible. And I agree with what Helen suggested too. Some of the offenses launched by the Obama administration in particular, I think put them on tricky ground. Defending religious freedom is, in a sense, easier. It's just a practical political matter. It requires one to make less ambitious arguments, you might say. You don't have to change the whole culture, than making the full-throated, pro-life argument or getting into the whole, big questions, which I'm in favor of getting into too, but about marriage and family and culture. You just have to say, really? I mean, the federal government is going to forbid religious institutions or businesses owned by people who have faith from buying health insurance policies that are in accord with their faith, and which, I mean, it's really an unbelievable overreach by the federal government. People like me thought it would hurt them. I think almost everyone did. When that opinion came down, when Secretary Sebelius issued that regulation, or I guess announced she was going to issue the regulation, which was, I think, just about a year ago, wasn't it? It was in January of 2012. I was doing a talk on, actually, a debate with a Democratic, I won't say who was, but a Democratic, operative and strategist, pretty well known. And he had worked in the Clinton administration. He's liberal, pro-choice, and all that stuff. But he had always, like Clinton in a way, been sensitive on this issue and had more of the Clintonian safe, legal, and rare, at least rhetoric on the issue, whatever he believed, whatever Clinton believed. And he thought, I remember I was with him that day, and we had 2 different talks to give, so we went in a car together from one to the other, and he made a few phone calls, and I couldn't help but overhear. I mean, he was urging his friends in the Obama administration, in the Obama White House, or in the top ranks of the Democratic Party, not to do this. And what are you doing? You're going to really antagonize millions of voters, especially Catholics, but not only Catholics, who will think this is just an assault on their institutions and totally unnecessary. I mean, what are who's actually being hurt by the kinds of health insurance plans that are adopted by whatever universities or other institutions that are hospitals that are at stake here, they're at issue here. And he thought they kind of had messed up. They hadn't really thought it through. They just had stumbled into this. Some bureaucrat had done a regulation, and it had gotten rubber stamped on the way up. And I remember him hanging up on his cell phone and telling me, no, they know what they're doing. They think this is a winning fight, and they want to have this fight, and they're ready for it. And, he thought it was unwise. I thought that seemed awfully risky to me from a political point of view. And since I was hoping they would lose, in a sense, I thought, okay, fine, let's have that fight. But I've got to say, they didn't pay any evident price that I could see for it politically. They doubled down in the campaign and made their case. And now I think so they didn't lose. So on the one hand, I suppose those of us who thought it was unwise of them were wrong. On the other hand, I do think they're now overconfident. They really, President Obama got 51.2%, is it, of the vote. The Democrats won a majority of the votes cast for Senate and the House. But we're not talking Reagan 60% here. We're not talking, unfortunately, a great Republican candidate or a huge number of very articulate conservative candidates running for Senate or for the House, or in some cases. And even so, these are pretty narrow majorities for the most part. And for them to now double down on this issue and on other related issues in the social and cultural sphere and in the pro-life area in particular, I think they could well overreach. And I do think as the religious freedom cases go up in the courts and as they get more publicity around the country, I think it's a big opportunity to play defense, so to speak, but also to make the arguments about what this kind of, not just protecting abortion rights, as they would put it, but also imposing kind of an abortion regime and a taxpayer-paid abortion regime on the country, what that will look like. So I don't think one should be totally depressed about the need to play defense over the next 4 years. And things sometimes happen in funny ways. I always, thinking back about my own government service, when I worked I've discussed this with Gary Bauer a lot, when we both worked for Bill Bennett at the Education Department. you don't know ahead of time which fights will work out better for you politically, or not just politically in the narrow sense, but sort of in terms of advancing the broader agenda. So Bill Bennett comes in '85. I joined him a few months later, and one of his main priorities was school choice. Vouchers, charter schools, parental control, parental choice, a very familiar education reform argument that many people in this room probably know very well and probably have been involved in for now it's a long time, right? Plus more than 25 years. And we thought we could make real progress, and we had legislative proposals to get federal funds to follow the student, and we helped governors try to articulate this, and we helped Polly Williams in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, do this at the local level, and we did it. Bennett gave, Bill is terrifically good at this, gave many eloquent speeches and interviews and all that. So that was our main focus. We thought that's how we were going to advance the general issue of parental control, parental choice, sort of decentralization, liberalization in the very old-fashioned sense of the word of what was a kind of monopolistic government-dominated American public education system. I don't know that we made much progress, honestly, after all that. And even now, 25 years later, the progress has been fairly limited. On the side, there was this very new little homeschooling movement that had just been legalized in many states. People forget this in '85, and was still being fought bitterly by many state bureaucracies who were trying to prevent it. Chuck O'Malley was there running a tiny office of private education. We had a couple of people in the council's office who were sort of working on this, and we didn't have any real authority on it, but we did try to help the homeschoolers in different states as they fought the state bureaucracies, providing legal counsel in appropriate ways, and providing encouragement and publicizing some of their efforts, and publicizing some of the very early, this is very preliminary, of course, results that suggested it was working pretty well for the kids who were being homeschooled. I mean, I would now say that the rather modest things we did in those years, from '85 to '88, to help defend the nascent and growing homeschool movement, which, believe me, none of us, we did it because we thought it was the right thing to do, and we thought, well, it's kind of interesting, and maybe it'll have some payoff in a bigger way in the future. But it was mostly, we just did it we were part of the Reagan administration, we all believed in it, but it was, as I say, very much of a side interest. I don't imagine Bill Bennett spent, more than 5% as much time on that as he did on pushing school choice and vouchers. I would now say that was a more important achievement. I mean, it wasn't our achievement, it was mostly the homeschoolers' achievement, but we did help them. And in that respect, you don't know which fight, which initiative, which little social or cultural or political movement will ultimately pay off the most, and you do sort of have to, I think, try a lot of different things, make a lot of different arguments, not in a sophistic or calculating way, but just in the sense of arguments that you agree with, but advance in a variety of fronts, to use a military metaphor, and you don't know ahead of time sort of where you'll make breakthroughs. I've always thought that was a good lesson for me in sort of not overthinking, and in a way not over-strategizing. Sometimes people in this movement, our movement, but also in others too, you sort of sit around, have endless meetings, should we do this, should we do that, I think this piece of legislation could make a huge difference, or this state initiative could work, and this one won't. It turns out often you're wrong. This state initiative which looked good, turns out to have a bad spokesman, or the political circumstances change in this state, and something else that you barely thought about somewhere else takes off and gets imitated in 35 states. It was very much that way with homeschooling from our point of view. And I think that's a reason to, in playing defense and in trying to do small incremental steps, not to get discouraged, not to pull back and say, well, just try A, B, and C, but let's not do D, E, and F, because you just don't know whether D, E, or F might somehow end up causing more progress in a broader sense than A, B, or C. So that's a big task, I think, very much in the spirit of Bob Bork's, at least making things less bad as much as we can over the next few years. And then I do think there's also very much the other side of Bob's advice, which is sort of not abandoning the ship and, in effect, standing on principle. And there, I think, the pro-life movement has in many ways made great strides through real philosophic argumentation, through obviously science and publicizing some of the truths about the unborn child and about some of the biological truths, some of the sociological truths about what an abortion regime results in for women, for young women, for families, for everything else. You've heard a little bit about this today. And I think there the argument has to be very broad and bold. I spoke to the House Republicans last week, and this is a totally different context and budget policy, but I think it's true here too. My advice to them, I don't know that I have any particularly good advice, but since they asked for advice, not that they were listening, but I said, I guess I had only two pieces of advice. Act realistically, but think boldly. And I think that's basically right for a movement like ours as well. I think in practice over the next 2, 3, 4 years, a lot of realistic, incremental, modest things have to be attempted. Some will work, some won't work so well, but I think we can do some good. But I think thinking boldly, not just thinking, but arguing and making the big case for why this regime of the last 40 years is really damaging to the country, and it's obviously very directly damaging to the unborn children, and that's always the primary argument. But there are other arguments that appeal to people who are more uncertain about how to weigh the actual core pro-life argument. But making the bigger argument, I think, is very important. And there, too, as I sort of suggested before, I think in some ways there have been frustrations, in some ways the tide has gone against us, culturally perhaps and sociologically, but in other ways there have been a very interesting counter-movements and counter-tides. And the one thing I've learned just reading a little history and living now through a little more history as I've gotten older is these things are very unpredictable. You know, it's not the case that it's obvious which way the culture is going, and it's not the case that things don't go this way and then go back the other way, and you really can't know ahead of time exactly when you might get a pretty big change in the culture, and it might happen at the most unlikely time, you know, when it seems like you've just had a big defeat. So I think it's very important to both, as I say, act pretty realistically, pretty incrementally, and also make the case, the fundamental arguments boldly. I don't know if anyone referred to this piece in Salon from yesterday, this kind of shocking piece that appeared where this woman proudly says she does believe life begins at conception, and that's why she's pro-abortion rights, and you can't just, you know, respect every life, and it's kind of nuts, in my opinion, but revealing and interesting. It's interesting because she doesn't feel anymore that she can defend the proposition that this unborn child is just nothing, or it's just a clump of cells, or it's just a fetus. I mean, she really says, yes, of course it's an unborn child. I mean, how can anyone look at the ultrasound and not think otherwise? But we still need to make the case that the mother's life, not mother's life, the mother's choice, the mother's wish is more important than the unborn child's life. And she makes this case, you should Google and take a look at it in Salon magazine. She makes this case very boldly, and she's a pretty good writer. So it takes a while to realize just how amazing and how jarring it is. But it does show the kind of problems now that those who are for abortion are having in light of modern science and in light of the difficulty of avoiding the life issue. I mean, she makes a big deal about how clever it was for pro-life advocates to seize on the term life as if that was like a very brilliant strategic choice, you know. It's like, well, it is a life, so, you know. But it does sort of suggest the intellectual problems I think they're having, which I think will ultimately result and result in political problems and will allow for much bigger advances for the pro-life movement. And maybe not in this, I was going to say in the future, and maybe in the somewhat far off future, but maybe not in the so far off future. And that's where I really don't think it's easy to predict how much progress one could make. I'd say if you'd asked me at different moments of the last 40 years, I probably would have been wrong pretty consistently in saying we're going to make a lot of progress in the next 5 years, and then everything turns out we didn't make any, and then, oh, these 5 years look horrible, and it turns out you do make progress in some way that you really hadn't anticipated. So I think it's important not to assume that we know ahead of time and just to fight the good fight. I was thinking about Bob Bork's funeral, which is a very Catholic funeral. I'm not Catholic, but I was thinking, therefore, somewhat about my own religion, Judaism, and I thought I could end by saying because I really am so impressed by the pro-life movement in this way. I mean, it really is a movement that is selfless. It's not, there's no one has any, I take it, much financial stake in it. There's a lot more rewards to be gotten financially, culturally, in terms of career often, on the other side of this fight. And it is such an impressive movement in that respect, I think, as a sort of civic and political matter. I'm not sure it gets the credit it deserves in textbooks that write all about civil society and cultural movements and talk about the civil rights movement, which is fine. I mean, that was also a very impressive movement, and a lot of people sacrificed a lot and did so because they thought it was the right thing, but surely that's the case for the pro-life movement. For me, I mean, the movement that I think of is the Zionist movement before the beginning of the State of Israel, which also, it's not as if most people who fought for that were going to go live in Israel or had a direct, you know, financial or personal stake in it in some respect. They just thought it was the right thing for the Jewish people, and an awful lot of Jews, an awful lot of non-Jews spent an awful lot of time and energy fighting in that cause, and that cause isn't over either, obviously. But it made me think of Judaism, and the comparison did. And of one particular aspect of one thing that happens occasionally in synagogue, which I'll just mention. So we read the 5 books of the Torah, of the Bible. If you're Orthodox, in a cycle through every year. If you're conservative reform, usually every 3 years. But the point is, you're supposed to read the Bible and then reread it, finish it, and then reread it, and it goes in the same order, obviously, and sort of divided in certain sections. And the custom grew up. It's not religiously required, but I think it's done now in most synagogues. Grew up over the last centuries of, at the moment when you finish one of the books and you've achieved this study, which you're of course commanded to do as a Jew of Scripture, the congregation stands up and says, in celebration of finishing Genesis or Exodus or whatever, Chazak, Chazak, v'nit chazek, which is be strong, which is based on the beginning of Joshua, and is be strong, may we be strengthened. And it's echoing what God, as you may recall at the beginning of Joshua, says to Joshua, which is basically 3 times he says some version of be strong, and he uses that Hebrew word chazak. It's also, I believe, where the phrase be not afraid, which John Paul II was so fond of, comes from as well. He's in those verses right near the beginning of Joshua. And I do think I've always very much liked, I'm not such as observant a synagogue attender as I should be, but when I find myself there, and I'm always pleased when we're finishing one of the books of the Bible, because even though I don't deserve any particular, I haven't often been there, so it's not like I've participated that much in this reading and study. Somehow when the congregation as a whole stands up and says, to itself, in a way, be strong, may we be strengthened, I've always thought that's a sort of moving and appropriate moment, and I would say that for us too here, that we really need to, despite the discouragements of maybe the last few months and in some ways of years and all the setbacks and the hopes that have been frustrated, there have also been great accomplishments and achievements, and so I really applaud you for everything you've done and say to you that you should be and we should be strong and may we be strengthened in the future. Thank you.
It's really gratifying to have had an idea in your mind of what you wanted something to turn out like, and then it far exceeds your expectations. Thank you so much, Bill, because act realistically and think boldly is exactly the note that I wanted us to hit today. There's no point in denying the challenges that we have. We're commemorating 40 years of Roe v. Wade. There's no denying that there's an element of sorrow there. But at the same time, this is a great and glorious cause that we're in together. And so we are here today committed to acting realistically and thinking boldly, although I think I might want to reverse the order on that. I wanted to, if you'll stay with me for just a few moments, to put a very brief epilogue on the day. We chose the red roses in honor of the March for Life and the fact that so many of our friends have year after year after year come out in absolutely challenging weather to commemorate Roe year after year after year. And the March for Life has a tradition of laying red roses on the steps of the Supreme Court. And so I wanted to do that today to commemorate the 55 million lives that we've lost. But moving from there, I do hope that we are inspired here together today by, we put together the program and put invitations out there, and we're so pleased with the people who agreed to join us today. And you have these names on a page, and then I just kept thinking as our afternoon together went on, it's so thrilling to hear the voices come alive and to bring the different perspectives and to have that mixed together into a movement that moves us forward into this next evolution of fighting this battle. Well, if you'll humor me with this thought of being optimistic as we move forward, I wanted to come back to where I started, which is with Batgirl versus the baby. Partly because it is absurd. It is absurd. Today we've wanted to emphasize the intellectual arguments and where we move from here, so I'm a little hesitant to come back to Batgirl. But the absurdity of it really intrigues me, Batgirl versus the baby. For those of you who weren't here, I mentioned the fact that the new president of NARAL, who was selected because she is relatively young and hip in her early 40s, has a Twitter avatar showing herself as Batgirl, which I think is quite absurd and revelatory of where the feminist movement is today in terms of it's an avatar that represents the idea that somehow abortion and all that goes along with it is about feminine empowerment. But as I didn't actually have these remarks all that prepared because they came to me this morning as I was thinking about the overarching picture of this day. And in thinking of Batgirl versus the baby, it really does express for me the really, really deep sorrow and the deep tragedy of Roe, which is that it is absurd because it turns the real feminine power completely on its head, because it sets women, it sets women against our babies. And isn't that one of the greatest unique things about feminine power, is that ability to participate in the creation of new life? Batgirl versus the baby, setting the woman against her baby, how obscene is that? How obscene is it? Bill, I'm glad you mentioned the Salon article. I brought it up this morning, and I wanted to bring back around one last quote from her, from Mary Beth Williams, that I did not use this morning. She said, "I would put the life of a mother over the life of a fetus every single time, even if I still need to acknowledge my conviction that the fetus is indeed a life worth sacrificing." A life worth sacrificing. How dare she? She's so glib. She's so glib as she says this, but the ramifications for this are so deeply serious for all of us, because this way lies brute oppression. A life worth sacrificing. Who is she to make that decision? But it has ever been thus, that tyrants begin sacrificing lives that they deem unworthy. That they deem unworthy. I was so honored that Johnny Tata was willing to send us a video today, because of course her travel is somewhat limited. But I wanted to have that element with us today, this recognition that they are choosing which lives they deem worthy of protection and defense. Make no mistake, Roe at 40 is about raw, brute, callous power over the helpless. Just because Planned Parenthood puts it in a very trendy hot pink does not make it any less tyranny. Americans as a majority are personally opposed to abortion. I've had so many reporters this week ask me about the data that shows that Americans do not want to reverse Roe. This doesn't surprise me, nor does it actually trouble me. The reason for that is because it is a fundamental American value to be tolerant. Americans do not want to pass judgment on others who have what they deem to be a different opinion. Planned Parenthood is very savvy to this, and that's why I was mocking them this morning by repeating their refrain that it's complicated. But I do believe that's a brilliant strategy on their part, because Americans, that's where they want to live with this issue. They want to just let it be complicated and let someone else worry about it. I think about this question a lot in terms of leading AUL and being a part of the pro-life movement. I believe that one of the biggest challenges we have is answering the question, why should I care? It's someone else's decision. Live and let live. It's Planned Parenthood. They're saying they're going to talk about a personal decision. You haven't walked in her shoes. Let her be. Let her. Why does it matter to the community? Why does it matter to the community what her personal decision is? It does matter, because life tends to be complicated. It tends to be complicated and messy. And in that is where life is beautiful. So the question that the life movement struggles with as to why someone else's choice matters to the community at large is because the answer comes back to this question of power. Tyranny is not a human impulse that is easily tamed, that's locked away over there under the only for abortion category, only when it's complicated. Roe at 40 is a question of who we all are and what a civilized community will tolerate. Batgirl is a hip chick. There is no doubt about that. But it's also a perfect symbol for the radical individualism from which abortion originates and which it helps to perpetuate. I can't help going back to my poli-sci roots. I loved my political theory classes. And I was really struck as an undergrad, it stuck with me, the study of postmodernism and the existentialists and how they defend their philosophy. And it has stuck with me all these years hearing Sartre as he is describing his existentialist philosophy and his sense of the aspirational human. And he said, we are left alone without excuses. We are condemned to be free. As Americans, isn't that a really intriguing concept? Because freedom, we believe, is so foundational to who we are. So how is it a condemnation? I believe in abortion, we truly see how we are condemned by freedom. By setting mother against child, mother against father, abortion strikes at the very heart of human community. It is this fabric that knits us together, of a man and a woman falling in love and coming together and creating a family. That's part of the fabric that brings us together, that creates a community and a nation. There's a study that has gotten almost no attention, but it really jumped out at me recently. They found that for older women, and men, 1/3 of adults aged 45 to 63 are now unmarried. 1/3. This represents more than a 50% increase since 1980, when just 20% of middle-aged Americans were unmarried. 1 out of 3 of these were never married. Never married. Ladies and gentlemen, why does somebody else's choice matter to the rest of us? Because it is striking at the heart of community. Increasingly, we are living alone. A woman doesn't go to an abortion clinic because she wants an abortion. She goes to an abortion clinic because she feels alone. Because she feels alone, because she feels she has no choice. That's what strikes at the heart of human community. That affects all of us. It affects all of us at the end when women are alone. It's encouraging to me today, and I hope you are inspired as well, that there's so many of us here today who have come committed to acting realistically and thinking boldly, thinking very boldly. It's going to be an exciting day tomorrow when hundreds of thousands, I believe, will be on the nation's capital, on the mall, with roses to commemorate the lives lost. But as we move forward into this next decade of fighting Roe, we need to work very carefully to ensure that people understand that this movement is also about the women and men who have been damaged by abortion. That abortion leaves us alienated from each other, and it leaves women and men alone. Thank you so much for being here today. God bless you, and we're dismissed.